War is usually imagined as something loud, something relentless and dramatic, full of noise and urgency. But most of the people who actually lived through World War II didn't experience it that way, not every day anyway. What they experienced more than anything else was fear. This was a fear that stayed, that settled in quietly, the way a guest sometimes does, and refused to leave. It was there in the morning when people woke up, and still there in the evening when they tried to sleep. It was there for months, for years, until slowly and without anyone quite noticing when it happened, it stopped feeling like fear at all. It just became the air that people breathed. Some of what you hear tonight might stay with you, some of it might surprise you. All of it is true. Let it come gently, one thought at a time. In whatever stillness you have found for yourself tonight, there is nothing you need to do with any of it. Just let the words arrive softly, at their own pace. The world outside is calm, you are safe, and we begin. Fact number 1. Soviet soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front from the very first days of the German invasion in June 1941, all the way through to the final battles in Berlin and Manchuria in 1945, went through one of the most complete changes in their relationship to fear that military psychologists have ever documented in any war. In those first terrible weeks of the invasion, when entire Soviet army groups were surrounded and destroyed, when the scale of the disaster was almost beyond comprehension, the fear those soldiers felt was total and overwhelming. The structures that might have given people psychological support had effectively collapsed. There was very little to hold on to. But over the following months and years, something shifted, not courage in the dramatic sense. The veterans themselves, when they were interviewed decades later, didn't describe it as a victory over their fear. They described it as something quieter and more gradual than that. The fear had simply been present for so long, so woven into every single moment of daily existence, that somewhere below conscious thought, the nervous system had quietly reclassified it. It stopped treating the fear as an emergency requiring a special response. It became background instead. The way a clock ticking in the same room eventually stops being something you consciously hear. The fear was still there. It had simply been absorbed, slowly and entirely without drama, into the texture of being alive. Fact number 2. Somewhere in the middle of the London Blitz, a researcher conducting surveys of civilian morale noticed something that surprised her enough to write about it with considerable emphasis in her field notes. The people she was interviewing, working-class families in the East End, people who had been bombed out of their homes, who had lost neighbors, who were sleeping in underground shelters every single night, were not describing their lives in the language of fear. They were describing them in the language of mild inconvenience. The raids were a nuisance. The shelters were uncomfortable. The broken sleep was tiresome. Her first instinct was that this was bravado, a performance of toughness for the benefit of the interviewer. But the more she listened, the more she became convinced it wasn't a performance at all. It was genuine. The fear was still present. She could see it in the physical responses people described when a raid began. The tightening of the stomach, the quickening of the breath. But at the level of conscious description, something had shifted. The experience had been quietly reframed. It had become a feature of life rather than an assault on it. Speaking of it in the full terms of terror, every day, indefinitely, that was simply not something the human mind could sustain, and so the language had adapted, not to hide the fear, but to carry it. Fact number 3. Children who grew up in cities under sustained bombing developed a relationship with physical danger that researchers, studying them years later, found quietly remarkable in its matter-of-factness. A study of British children evacuated from London found that many of them, when asked to draw pictures of their neighborhoods, included bomb craters, destroyed buildings, and ARP wardens as entirely ordinary features of the landscape, drawn with exactly the same visual weight and the same casual attention as trees, lampposts, and the corner shop. The ruined building wasn't a source of distress in the drawing because it wasn't a source of acute distress in the child's daily experience. It was simply there as it had been yesterday, as it would presumably be tomorrow. Psychologists who reviewed these drawings were divided about what they meant. Some saw in them a healthy adaptation, the child's mind finding a way to continue functioning. Others saw something more concerning, an emotional flattening that might have consequences later. The research that followed these children into adulthood suggested that both interpretations held some truth. The adaptation was real, and it did protect the children from a kind of acute damage that sustained fear might otherwise have caused. But it also left marks, quieter and more indirect, that surfaced later in ways the calm, careful drawings hadn't predicted. Fact number 4. German civilians living in cities being progressively destroyed by Allied bombing developed a way of talking about the raids that is one of the most revealing records we have of how fear gradually becomes ordinary. The official Nazi term for Allied bombing raids was Terrorangriff, terror attack, a phrase designed to emphasize violence and victimhood, but the informal language that civilians actually used among themselves was strikingly different in tone. Raids were discussed in practical terms: how many houses had gone, whether the bakery on the corner was still standing, whether the trams were running. The emotional language of fear was largely absent, not because the fear wasn't there, but because its constant, full expression had become socially unsustainable. A community that gave voice to its terror continuously, without restraint, would simply have been unable to function. The shopping, the working, the small daily interactions that held neighborhoods together required the gradual, collective achievement of a normality that the fear's full expression would have continuously undermined. This wasn't denial. The people doing it were not pretending that nothing terrible was happening. It was something more sophisticated than denial. The shared, unspoken decision of a community to continue functioning inside conditions that functioning required treating as manageable. The language adapted to the fear, because the alternative was not to function at all. Fact number 5. Pilots who flew multiple combat tours during the war went through a transformation in their experience of fear before missions that aviation psychologists at the time documented with considerable precision. A pilot flying his very first combat mission experienced the full, acute physiological response to fear: elevated heart rate, heightened senses, a narrowing of thought, the body's complete mobilization for immediate survival. A pilot flying his 50th mission experienced something measurably different: not the absence of fear, but a different version of it, flatter, less acute, more integrated into what combat flying had established as simply a normal level of arousal. Aviation medicine studies conducted during the war found that experienced pilots showed genuinely different physiological profiles before missions than inexperienced ones, not calmer in any absolute sense but differently calibrated. Their resting state had been elevated by experience to a level where the mission's additional stress was a smaller increment above what had already become ordinary. The normalization was therefore not just psychological. The body itself had been physically recalibrated, through repetition, to treat as unremarkable a level of stress that at the beginning of a combat career had been anything but. What had once been exceptional had become, through sustained exposure, simply the way a working day began. Fact number 6. Resistance fighters in occupied Europe who survived long enough to become experienced operatives described a specific transition in their relationship to fear, one that typically happens somewhere between their 3rd and 6th operation, and that veterans consistently identified as the point at which the work had become, in some fundamental sense, normal. Before this transition, each operation was its own separate fear event. The anxiety built through days of preparation, peaked during the hours of execution, and then released in a wave of relief afterward whose intensity matched the fear that had preceded it. After the transition, the same cycle continued, but the emotional amplitude of each phase had been noticeably reduced. The preparatory fear was still present but more manageable. The operational fear was still there but more focused and directed. The relief at the end was quieter. What had been achieved was not fearlessness. It was something more practical than that: a working relationship with fear, a functional integration of it into the routine that allowed it to inform decisions rather than overwhelm them. The veterans who described this transition didn't present it as an unambiguous gain. The reduction of fear's intensity had made the work more sustainable, but it had also reduced a sensitivity to danger that in its original acute form had served genuinely protective purposes. Something had been gained. Something too had been quietly lost. Fact number 7. Medical staff in field hospitals close to active fronts developed, over months of extended service, a professional equanimity in the presence of injury and death that their training had begun to build, but that only the sustained reality of wartime practice could complete. A nurse or surgeon who had spent 6 months in a field hospital in North Africa had encountered more severe trauma, more death, and more human suffering than any peacetime career would have produced in a lifetime. Managing this exposure had required a process of emotional adaptation whose end result was a functional professional calm in the presence of things that would, at the beginning of those 6 months, have produced acute and genuine distress. The military medical system recognized this adaptation as operationally necessary. Medical personnel who responded to each casualty with the full emotional reaction their humanity prompted would have been unable to provide effective care. The development of professional emotional regulation was therefore understood as part of what the job required. What the system was much less good at recognizing was the cost of this adaptation, the specific form of emotional numbing that sustained exposure to trauma produces in the people managing it, and that surfaces when the sustained exposure finally ends. The delayed reactions, the quiet difficulties. The profession would only develop adequate frameworks for understanding these things much later, in the decades after the war, when it was finally safe to look back at what the work had actually required. Fact number 8. Throughout the Pacific Island campaigns, American and Japanese soldiers alike developed a relationship with the fear of jungle terrain that transformed over weeks and months of sustained exposure from an acute and debilitating anxiety into a managed background awareness. The jungle's specific fear, the visual impenetrability, the acoustic overwhelm, the knowledge that an enemy who had mastered concealment was somewhere within it, was, for soldiers encountering it for the first time, one of the most psychologically demanding environments the war produced. Men trained in organized, legible military camps found the jungle's refusal to provide the visual information that ordinary orientation requires genuinely disorienting, and the fear that produced was both intense and practically debilitating. Experienced jungle fighters described the transition to a functional working knowledge of the environment in terms that were consistent across different nationalities and different theaters, a gradual learning of the jungle's specific language of sounds and signs, a developing capacity to distinguish the sounds of threatening human movement from the constant ambient noise of a living forest, and a consequent reduction of diffuse unlocatable fear into something more specific, more contained, and more manageable. The jungle had not become safe, but it had become known, and the known, however dangerous, is always less frightening than the unknown. Fact number 9. Civilians in Malta during the island's 2.5-year siege developed what contemporaries described as a Maltese stoicism, something that was simultaneously a cultural expression and a genuine psychological achievement, a functional normality maintained in the face of conditions that made normal life almost impossible. Malta was bombed more intensively per square mile than any other territory in the entire war. By the peak of the bombing campaign in April 1942, the island was being struck by an average of 10 raids per day. The civilian population that survived this campaign did so by developing a relationship with the bombing that was remarkable in its matter-of-factness. Shelters were used with routine efficiency. Raids were accommodated around the schedule of daily activities rather than allowed to dominate them. The damage to buildings was assessed and addressed with a practical organization that left little room for the acute emotional response the scale of destruction might have been expected to produce. The Maltese experience of sustained aerial bombardment was one of the most thoroughly documented examples of collective fear normalization in the entire war. Its study produced insights into civilian psychological adaptation that influenced both wartime policy and post-war psychological research for decades. Fact number 10. Submariners who completed multiple war patrols developed a sensory relationship with their vessel that was one of the most complete examples of environmental fear normalization in the entire conflict. A new crew member heard the sounds of the submarine's operation, the creaks and groans of the pressure hull, the mechanical noises of the various systems, the acoustic world of underwater navigation, as a frightening and largely unintelligible background against which the specific sounds of danger could not be reliably distinguished. An experienced submariner heard exactly the same sounds as a legible vocabulary, a set of specific, meaningful signals whose normal patterns were known, and whose deviations from those patterns provided genuine operational information. The fear normalization of the experienced submariner was therefore, in significant part, a product of knowledge, the replacement of unintelligible and therefore frightening noise with intelligible and therefore manageable information. What had once produced acute fear in a new crew member, precisely because it could not be interpreted, produced a different and more calibrated response in an experienced one who could place it accurately within the boat's operational language and assess clearly and calmly what, if anything, it required. Fact number 11. Throughout occupied France, ordinary civilians who had initially experienced the German occupation with acute fear, the fear of arbitrary arrest, of deportation, of the random violence that occupation authority could deploy against any individual at any time, developed, over months and years, a functional daily life that operated within the presence of this fear rather than being continuously disrupted by it. The fear did not diminish. The dangers were real throughout the occupation years, and the specific events that periodically confirmed their reality, arrests in the neighborhood, the deportation of known families, the public execution of resistance members, refreshed the fear with an acute intensity that daily routine had temporarily softened. But between these acute moments, the civilian population of occupied France found ways to incorporate the background presence of occupation fear into the routines of shopping, working, socializing, and family life in ways that allowed something recognizable as normal daily existence to continue. This was not denial. The people who achieved it were not pretending the danger didn't exist. It was something more sophisticated and more demanding than denial. The maintenance of functional daily life in full awareness of the fear, through the deliberate cultivation of routines and human connections that provided the stability and meaning that the fear's full expression would have continuously undermined. Fact number 12. Artillery barrages that preceded major infantry assaults were among the loudest sounds ever produced by human activity up to that point in history. The soldiers who lived through extended periods of artillery fire, both those delivering it and those receiving it, underwent acoustic adaptations whose physical and psychological dimensions wartime medicine was only beginning to understand. The First World War had produced high rates of shell shock, whose physical component included specific hearing damage and neurological disruption caused by the concussive effect of repeated close-range explosions. Second World War military medicine had developed some understanding of these mechanisms and had implemented protective measures, ear protection, limitations on continuous exposure, recognition of the cumulative neurological effects of sustained concussive experience. But soldiers who endured extended periods of artillery combat still underwent sensory adaptations that were in their own way a form of physical fear normalization. The body, exposed repeatedly to sounds and concussions it had initially treated as emergency stimuli, gradually recalibrated its response to them. It reduced the acute physiological alarm reaction. It incorporated the sounds into a baseline of operational noise that allowed functional activity to continue. And it paid for this recalibration in forms of physical damage that accumulated below the threshold of immediate awareness, surfacing in hearing loss, neurological symptoms, and psychological difficulties that only became fully apparent later. Fact number 13. In the ghettos established by Nazi authorities across occupied Poland, Jewish civilians confined within them underwent a psychological adaptation to conditions of extreme and sustained threat that produced one of the most extensively documented examples of collective fear normalization in the entire wartime record. The specific character of ghetto fear normalization was shaped by the progressive nature of the threat. Each stage of restriction and deprivation was absorbed and adapted to before the next stage arrived, creating a process of gradual psychological adjustment that the sudden imposition of the final conditions all at once might not have permitted. Families who had adapted to the loss of their businesses adapted next to the loss of their homes. Those who adapted to the loss of their homes adapted to relocation into the ghetto. Those who adapted to ghetto life adapted to the progressive reduction of the food ration. Each adaptation was genuine and each came at a cost, and the cumulative effect was a population whose capacity to recognize and respond to existential threat had been shaped by the specific history of their accommodation to previous threats, in ways the perpetrators of the final stage understood and deliberately exploited. The normalization of fear in the ghettos was not a failure of perception or a failure of courage. It was the product of a psychological process that the conditions had been deliberately designed to produce. Fact number 14. Veterans of the Italian campaign described with a frequency and a specificity that makes it one of the most clearly documented features of that particular theater, the normalization of the specific fear of minds. It was a fear with no equivalent in most other forms of military danger, because it was simultaneously constant, entirely random in its specific application, and impossible to manage through any skill or alertness the individual soldier could develop. A minefield could not be navigated through courage or professional expertise the way enemy fire could be partially managed through tactical skill. It could only be cleared through specific technical procedures, avoided through roads that had been swept, or crossed with the acceptance of a random risk that had no relationship whatsoever to the individual soldier's qualities or decisions. The randomness of mine danger, the knowledge that the man to your left might be killed by a mine that the man to your right had stepped over without triggering, produced a specific form of fear whose normalization required the development of a relationship with pure random chance that most human psychological frameworks for managing fear simply did not provide. Veterans of mine-heavy theaters described an acceptance of this randomness that they could not entirely reconcile with any framework of personal agency, a grudging, uncomfortable peace with the knowledge that some things were simply beyond the reach of anything they could do, and that the fear of those things had to be carried, because it could not be managed away. Fact number 15. Naval personnel aboard convoy escort vessels who made multiple Atlantic crossings during the worst years of the U-boat campaign developed a working relationship with the fear of torpedo attack, shaped by the specific sensory environment of convoy escort duty in ways that were unique to that experience. The Atlantic was dark for large portions of each crossing, and the darkness contained within it the specific possibility of an attack that would arrive as a sound, the detonation of a torpedo against a merchant vessel's hull, before it was visible or preventable. Experienced escort sailors described learning to sleep during their off-watch periods with a portion of their awareness maintained at a level that would register the sounds of an attack without preventing the rest that operational effectiveness required. This partial sleep, a monitoring alertness maintained within deeper states of rest, was a physiological adaptation the body had developed without conscious instruction. In response to the repeated experience of being awakened to emergency, it was qualitatively different from peacetime sleep, shallower, more interrupted, less fully restorative. Its maintenance across months and years of Atlantic crossings accumulated a sleep debt that manifested in the specific exhaustion that convoy veterans described as one of the most persistent physical legacies of their service. The body had adapted to the fear by never fully sleeping again, a solution that worked, but one that came at a cost the adaptation itself could not address. Fact number 16. Children in occupied territories who grew up watching their parents navigate the daily demands and dangers of occupation developed a social intelligence specifically tuned to the management of fear in the presence of authority, a capacity to read the emotional and political atmosphere of any given situation with a precision that their peacetime peers, who had never needed to develop this skill, simply did not possess. These children learned early and thoroughly that certain things could not be said aloud, that certain questions could not be asked, that the presence of certain people required a specific adjustment of behavior and expression that was not deception in the ordinary moral sense but a survival skill the occupation had made as necessary as learning to walk. The specific fear of saying the wrong thing, of being overheard, of inadvertently revealing something that would bring occupation authority down on a family, was managed through the development of a social attentiveness that was by any measure extraordinary for its age. Adults who had been children in occupied territories consistently described this heightened social attentiveness as one of the most lasting legacies of their wartime experience, a sensitivity to authority, to unspoken dynamics, and to the specific signals of imminent danger that the occupation had required them to develop, and that peacetime life had never given them reason to put down. Fact number 17. Bomber crews who flew missions over heavily defended German cities went through a specific and well-documented psychological process in the management of their fear that the RAF's own medical services studied with considerable attention throughout the strategic bombing campaign. The acute fear of the outbound journey, the approach to the target through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, the specific vulnerability of the moment directly over the target itself, was something that even experienced crews described as never entirely normalizing. It remained in some form for the duration of a combat tour, but the anticipatory fear, the fear during the briefing, during preparation, during the waiting at dispersal for the order to start engines, this was the component that most completely normalized with experience. New crews described the pre-mission period as one of acute anxiety, racing thoughts, physical symptoms, difficulty concentrating. Experienced crews described a pre-mission routine that was more muted in its emotional expression, a focused, somewhat flat professional preparation that contained the fear without expressing it, that got through the waiting without being consumed by it, and that delivered the crew to the aircraft in a state of operational readiness that was, in its own quiet way, a remarkable achievement of sustained psychological management. Fact number 18. Throughout the war years in Britain, the sound of the all-clear siren, the long, steady note signaling the end of an air raid, produced a physiological response in civilian listeners that changed significantly over the course of the war. In the early months of the Blitz, the all-clear produced a relief that was intense, physical, and unmistakable, a genuine and comprehensive release of tension experienced as a bodily event as much as an emotional one. By the later years of the war, the same sound produced a response that was recognizable as relief, but significantly flatter in its physiological expression, more a cognitive acknowledgement than a bodily release, more a quiet notation that the operational period had ended than a genuine unburdening. This flattening of the all-clear response was documented by civilian health workers and mass observation researchers as one of the clearest visible indicators of the progressive normalization of raid fear in the civilian population. The acute alarm and relief cycle had been reduced, through repetition, to something closer to a routine operational rhythm, in which the beginning and ending of the dangerous period were marked and noted without producing the physiological intensity they had originally provoked. The all-clear had been designed to produce relief. By the later war years, it was producing something more like acknowledgement. Fact number 19. The specific fear of hunger, not the acute sudden fear of immediate danger, but the slower, more sustained fear of progressive starvation, became normalized in civilian populations across occupied Europe in ways that the psychology of food scarcity has only recently begun to adequately document. The process by which the fear of not having enough food transformed from an acute crisis response into a chronic background condition was shaped by the progressive nature of occupation rationing, reductions small enough in each individual step to be absorbed and adapted to before the next reduction arrived. Families who had adapted to 70% of their pre-occupation food availability adapted next to 60%, then to 50%, then to 40%. Each adaptation was genuine. Each came at a cost that accumulated quietly below the threshold of acute crisis. The most significant feature that post-war researchers identified was the effect of this prolonged fear on the body's own hunger signals, the progressive recalibration of the physiological hunger response to a lower baseline, so that the body gradually ceased to signal the level of deprivation it was experiencing with the intensity that acute hunger would have produced. The body, like the mind, had adapted to the fear of insufficient food by redefining sufficiency at a level the available supply could meet, an adaptation that sustained function, but one that came at a physical cost traced in the health outcomes of the generation that had experienced it. Fact number 20. Among the most revealing documents of wartime fear normalization are the letters that soldiers wrote home during extended periods of combat service. Letters that, read in sequence across months and years, show a progressive change in emotional register that is one of the clearest available records of the normalization process unfolding in real time. The letters of a soldier in his first weeks of combat are typically characterized by a specific emotional intensity, either the direct expression of fear and its management, or the slightly too emphatic reassurance of someone actively performing normality for a worried family. The letters of the same soldier 6 months or a year into combat service show a different register, a matter-of-factness about conditions the earlier letters had treated as dramatic, a casual mention of dangers the earlier letters had approached with visible significance, a tone that has integrated the combat environment into the baseline of daily life in a way that the language reflects, without the writer necessarily being aware that the reflection is happening. Reading these letters in sequence is one of the most intimate available experiences of what fear normalization looked and felt like from the inside, the gradual adjustment of language to a reality that had, through repetition and sustained exposure, simply become the only reality the writer had access to. Fact number 21. Guard duty at prisoner of war camps, performed night after night by soldiers whose primary experience had been combat, produced a specific and largely undocumented form of fear normalization, the gradual absorption of the specific tensions of security work into a baseline of professional routine. A guard who had spent 6 months walking the perimeter of a camp in darkness, alert for escape attempts that might or might not materialize, had developed a working relationship with the sustained low-level vigilance that the work required that was qualitatively different from the heightened alertness of his first weeks. The fear had not disappeared. The knowledge that an escape attempt could happen at any moment maintained a genuine background tension throughout every shift. But the acute, effortful alertness of the early weeks had been replaced by something more automatic and more sustainable, a professional attentiveness that operated with less conscious effort and less physiological cost. This transition was recognized by experienced security personnel as the mark of a competent professional, the point at which the vigilance required by the work had been sufficiently internalized to operate without the draining effort of conscious maintenance. It was also, and less beneficially, the point at which certain genuine signals could begin to be missed, because the monitoring had become too routine to remain fully sensitive to everything it was intended to catch. Fact number 22. Wartime nurses who worked in psychiatric wards treating soldiers with combat exhaustion developed, over extended periods of service, a specific professional relationship with the expressions of extreme fear and trauma their patients presented, one that allowed them to remain therapeutically present and professionally effective in the face of material that in the early weeks of their work had produced genuine personal distress. The process by which this professional equanimity was achieved was not taught in any nursing curriculum of the time. It was developed through experience, through the informal support of colleagues who had been doing the work longer, and through the personal psychological resources that individual nurses brought to the work and that the work itself progressively shaped. What the most experienced psychiatric nurses described was not the absence of emotional response to their patients' suffering, but the development of a different kind of response, one that was genuinely present to the suffering without being overwhelmed by it, that could hold a patient's fear and pain without taking it on as its own, that maintained the professional clarity necessary for effective care while remaining genuinely human in its engagement. This form of professional fear normalization was one of the most sophisticated psychological achievements of wartime nursing, and it was also one of the least formally recognized and least institutionally supported. Fact number 23. Throughout the war years in Germany, the progressive normalization of the fear that the Nazi state generated in its own civilian population, fear of the Gestapo, fear of denunciation by neighbors, fear of expressing opinions that might be reported, produced a social environment whose character historians studying the internal sociology of the Third Reich have documented in revealing and sobering detail. The fear of the Nazi surveillance apparatus was not uniform in its application. It varied significantly by social position, political history, and the behavior of the local Gestapo in any given area. But its normalization in the civilian population produced behavioral adaptations that extended far beyond the obvious avoidance of explicitly illegal activity. People learned to self-censor at levels of expression that went well beyond what formal regulations required, editing their conversations, managing their facial expressions, calibrating the content of their private letters against the possibility of interception. The specific social cost of this pervasive self-censorship, the erosion of genuine communication, the reduction of authentic human contact, the subtle but comprehensive modification of interpersonal trust, was one of the most significant and most lasting effects of the normalized fear that the Nazi state had deliberately cultivated in the population it governed. Fact number 24. Mountain troops who fought in the high alpine terrain of Italy, Norway, and the Soviet Union developed a relationship with the specific fears of altitude, cold, and exposure that distinguished them clearly from lowland soldiers encountering the same terrain for the first time. The acute fear of altitude, the physiological and psychological responses to extreme cold, to the physical exposure of high mountain terrain, to the particular dangers of avalanche, rockfall, and the navigational challenges of mountain warfare, was, for soldiers without prior mountain experience, one of the most comprehensively disorienting fear environments the war produced. Men trained in organized, legible military camps found the mountain's refusal to provide the visual information that ordinary orientation requires genuinely disorienting. The fear that resulted was both intense and practically debilitating. For trained and experienced mountain troops, the same environment was a known and manageable operational space, not without danger, but a danger that experience had made specific, legible, and therefore addressable through skill and preparation rather than through the helpless responses of acute unfamiliarity. The transformation from the former condition to the latter was the product of deliberate training, but it was also the product of the same sustained exposure that produced fear normalization everywhere else in the war. The gradual replacement of the unknown's diffuse terror with the known's specific and manageable risks. The mountain had not become safe, but it had become familiar. and familiarity had changed everything about how the danger within it could be met. Fact number 25. The women who worked as secret agents for the Special Operations Executive behind enemy lines in occupied Europe underwent a specific and well-documented process of fear normalization that the SOE's own training program attempted to accelerate through deliberate exposure, putting candidates under conditions of simulated interrogation, surveillance, and operational stress in order to begin the normalization process before agents were deployed into the actual conditions their work would require them to manage. The training-induced normalization was partial. It could not fully replicate the actual conditions of living a false identity in an occupied country under the constant possibility of denunciation, but it produced enough of the behavioral and psychological adaptation to give trained agents a significant advantage over untrained ones in the management of their operational fear. The women deployed as SOE agents into France, the Netherlands, and other occupied territories typically described a period of acute fear in their first weeks of operation. The specific terror of the first check by German security police, the first moment of social interaction in which the false identity had to be maintained under scrutiny, followed by a gradual settling of the acute fear into a professional alertness that was present and functional without being debilitating. The normalization of SOE agent fear was one of the most thoroughly managed and most carefully studied instances of deliberate fear adaptation that the entire war produced. Fact number 26. Across the Pacific Theater, the specific fear of Japanese banzai charges, mass infantry assaults conducted with suicidal intensity, trained into Japanese soldiers as a tactical expression of military and cultural values entirely foreign to the Western military tradition, underwent a process of normalization among American troops that was shaped by the specific character of what was being normalized. The first banzai charge that American soldiers encountered was by virtually every account one of the most terrifying combat experiences of their service. The noise, the speed, the apparent disregard for casualties, and the specific cultural unfamiliarity of an attack that Western military training had not prepared them for. Experienced Pacific veterans described their response to subsequent charges in terms strikingly different, more measured, more tactical, less emotionally overwhelmed, and more reliably effective in their defensive response. The normalization was not achieved through the reduction of the charge's objective danger. Banzai charges remained lethal throughout the Pacific War. It was achieved through the development of an experiential understanding of their specific character, one that allowed the fear they produced to be redirected from helpless overwhelm into the kind of focused tactical response that training had prepared, but that the first encounter's unfamiliarity had temporarily prevented from being accessed. Fact number 27. Something that the wartime records of civilians in repeatedly bombed cities reveal with striking consistency is the way that the geography of destruction became incorporated into daily navigation as a matter of simple practical routine, with bomb craters, collapsed buildings, and altered street configurations noted, accommodated, and eventually absorbed into the mental map of the urban environment without the emotional weight their presence might have been expected to carry. A Londoner who had walked to work through the same street for years, and who now walked through a version of that street from which 2 buildings had been removed by bombing, described the altered route not as a reminder of the violence that had produced the change, but simply as the current state of the street, the way it now was, as distinct from the way it had previously been. The emotional charge of the destruction had been neutralized by familiarity. The rubble had been there long enough to become part of the environment rather than an intrusion into it. City planners who studied this phenomenon after the war found that it had significant implications for reconstruction. The population that had lived inside the destruction had so thoroughly incorporated it into their environmental baseline that the rebuilding of the original streetscape sometimes felt, to those who had lived there, less familiar and less comfortable than the damaged version they had been quietly navigating for years. Fact number 28. Soldiers who served in North Africa discovered that the specific fear of armored warfare, the fear of the tank, with its combination of mobility, firepower, and apparent invulnerability, was one of the fears most susceptible to normalization through the development of practical counter-knowledge. The initial encounter with enemy armor produced, in infantry soldiers without previous experience, a specific and acute form of panic that military authorities called tank terror. a recognized psychological phenomenon whose management became a specific component of infantry training programs across all the major armies. Soldiers who experienced tank terror were responding to a genuine danger with an intensity that actually made their tactical response worse, freezing, running, or abandoning positions in ways that reduced their survival chances relative to the trained anti-tank defensive responses the military had developed. The normalization of tank fear through training and experience, the development of a working knowledge of armor's specific vulnerabilities and limitations that replaced undifferentiated terror with a more measured tactical assessment, was therefore one of the most practically important forms of fear adaptation that the war required. Its achievement in infantry units across multiple national armies was one of the more significant contributions of wartime military training to operational effectiveness. Fact number 29. The fear of death itself underwent a specific normalization in soldiers who served extended periods in high-casualty environments, a normalization documented by military psychiatrists across multiple national armies, and one whose implications for soldiers' post-war lives were recognized at the time as potentially significant, even if their full dimensions were only gradually understood in the decades that followed. The process by which the fear of one's own death was normalized in combat soldiers was not a simple desensitization. It was a more complex reconfiguration of the relationship between self-preservation instinct and operational function, one that allowed soldiers to continue doing what their military role required in environments where the probability of death was high and constantly present. Some soldiers described this reconfiguration as a form of prior acceptance, a deliberate psychological act of accepting one's own death as a likely or certain outcome that, once performed, reduced the fear of it to a level compatible with continued function. Others described it as a more passive process, a gradual fading of the acute death fear through the specific fatigue of sustaining it, until what remained was something more like a muted resignation than an active terror. Both forms were genuine, and both came with costs that surfaced in different forms at different times in the post-war lives of the men who had achieved them. Fact number 30. Civil defense workers, the RP wardens, fire watchers, ambulance drivers and rescue workers who responded to bombing raids in British cities throughout the Blitz and beyond, developed a professional relationship with the specific fear of working in bombed and burning environments that was one of the most practically significant forms of fear normalization in the entire civilian wartime experience. The work of civilian civil defense required the management of fear under conditions of genuine and present danger, entering bombed buildings before they were fully stabilized, working in fires, recovering casualties from rubble while the structural integrity of the surrounding environment remained uncertain. The acute fear that this work produced in its early phases was something that civil defense training attempted to prepare workers for, but that only actual experience could fully address. The progression from the fear-dominated responses of the early raids to the professional equanimity of experienced civil defense workers was documented in the records of civil defense organizations with a consistency that spoke to how reliably the normalization process occurred when the conditions for it were maintained. Experienced ARP wardens described their working state during raids as one of focused professional attention, present to the specific tasks of the immediate situation, managing the fear through the discipline of the work itself, and drawing on accumulated experience to calibrate their responses to the specific conditions of whatever was in front of them. Fact number 31. Partisans and guerrilla fighters operating in the mountains and forests of Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Soviet Union developed a relationship with the specific fear of encirclement, the tactical situation in which a superior enemy force surrounds and traps a guerrilla unit, that was one of the most critical and most carefully managed forms of fear normalization in irregular warfare. The fear of encirclement was not, for experienced partisan fighters, the diffuse and undifferentiated terror it produced in fighters encountering it for the first time. It was a specific and identifiable tactical situation with specific characteristics that experience had made familiar, and that the accumulated knowledge of previous encirclements had taught the specific responses most likely to be effective. Yugoslav partisan commanders who had survived multiple German encirclement operations described the management of their unit's fear during these situations in terms that emphasized the importance of experienced leadership, the capacity of veterans to model the kind of controlled, tactical fear response that the situation required, and to communicate through their own behavior the message that encirclement was a serious but manageable tactical problem, rather than a death sentence. The normalization of encirclement fear in experienced partisan units was therefore as much a social phenomenon as an individual one, achieved through the specific social influence of veterans on less experienced fighters, and maintained through the shared culture of tactical competence that sustained guerrilla units developed over time. Fact number 32. Wartime factory workers who produced munitions, explosives, and other dangerous materials developed a working relationship with the specific occupational fears of their industry that was shaped by a combination of formal safety training and the informal normalization that sustained daily exposure produced. The specific fears of munitions work, the fear of accidental detonation, of chemical exposure, of the inherent hazards of working with materials that were by their nature lethal, were present throughout the working lives of the people who did this work, but they were managed through a combination of procedural discipline and the gradual development of a familiarity with the work's specific risk profile that reduced the diffuse anxiety of the unfamiliar to the more manageable specific attention of the known. Workers who had been doing the same job for months or years described their relationship to its dangers in terms that distinguished clearly between the routine risks that normal safety procedures managed adequately and the specific departures from routine that required heightened attention and response. This calibration of attention, the ability to distinguish between the ordinary background danger of the work and the specific elevated risk that required a different response, was the practical expression of fear normalization in the industrial context, and its development in wartime munitions workers was as important to industrial safety and production efficiency as any formal safety procedure. Fact number 33. The specific fear of gas attack, a fear whose roots lay in the First World War's devastating use of chemical weapons, and that had been deliberately cultivated by pre-war civil defense preparations across Britain and other European countries, underwent a gradual and revealing normalization over the course of the Second World War, as the gas attack that the preparations had anticipated failed to materialize. British civilians who had been issued gas masks in 1938 and 1939, who had practiced their use with genuine anxiety, and who had carried them conscientiously in the early months of the war, gradually stopped carrying them as the months passed without a gas attack. By 1941, the sight of a civilian carrying a gas mask had become unusual rather than universal, a visible indicator of the normalization of a fear whose object had proved, at least in the British context, to be non-existent. The specific psychology of this normalization was different from the normalization of fears whose objects were real and repeatedly encountered. It was the normalization that occurs when an anticipated danger fails to arrive, when the vigilance maintained against a specific threat gradually dissolves through the simple absence of confirming experience. The gas mask's fate, from essential daily equipment to forgotten accessory left behind on the hall table, was one of the most revealing behavioral documents of civilian fear normalization in the entire war. Fact number 34. Japanese civilians who endured the firebombing of their cities in 1944 and 1945 developed a relationship with the fear of aerial attack shaped by the specific character of the B-29 bombing campaign, a campaign that operated at altitudes and scales that made the bombers themselves invisible or barely visible, but produced destruction on a scale that exceeded anything the civilian population had previously experienced, and that arrived with a frequency and intensity that increased progressively over the final year of the war, rather than maintaining the consistent rhythm that normalization requires. The specific difficulty of normalizing B-29 raid fear was that the raids did not settle into a predictable pattern. They escalated, in scale, in frequency, in destructive effect, in a trajectory that prevented the establishment of the stable baseline against which normalization could occur. Japanese civilian diaries from the firebombing period document a fear that was neither fully acute nor fully normalized, a fear that was managed and functioned within, but that retained a quality of raw intensity that the raid's escalating character prevented from settling into the flat professional equanimity that sustained but stable danger tended to produce. The firebombing fear was one of the few forms of civilian wartime fear that the normalization process was not able to fully complete before the war's end intervened, partly because the raids were too severe, and partly because they did not last long enough in any one configuration to allow full adaptation before the next escalation arrived. Fact number 35. Medics who served with frontline infantry units, moving between positions under fire to treat casualties, marked as non-combatants by the Red Cross armband that opposing forces did not always honor, developed a specific and practically oriented form of fear normalization shaped by the particular character of their role. The medic's fear was not managed through the tactical responses available to combat soldiers, taking cover, returning fire, using the weapons and positions of conventional infantry defense. The medic moved toward the wounded rather than away from the fire. The management of the fear that this movement required was achieved through a professional focus on the specific immediate task, the assessment of the casualty, the application of treatment, the management of evacuation, that displaced the fear's acute expression through the displacement of attention from self-preservation to patient care. The normalization of medic fear through professional task focus was one of the most complete and most practically effective forms of fear management in the entire wartime record, not because the medics were not afraid, but because the specific character of their work provided a focus powerful enough to redirect the fear's energy from paralysis into the specific purposeful action that their patient's survival required. Veterans of frontline medical service described this task-focus-based fear management as both a survival mechanism and a form of profound professional meaning, the fear managed not by being suppressed but by being given somewhere useful to go. Fact number 36. Throughout the siege of Leningrad, the civilian population of the city developed a relationship with the fear of death by starvation that was one of the most extreme and most thoroughly documented examples of hunger-related fear normalization in the entire wartime record. The progressive starvation of the siege, the ration reductions that moved in steps from inadequate to insufficient to lethal, produced a specific psychological trajectory in the surviving population that diaries and testimonies preserved in Russian archives document with extraordinary detail and emotional honesty. The acute fear of starvation, the vivid, tormenting awareness of the body's progressive deterioration and of the gap between what was available and what survival required, gradually transformed, in many survivors' accounts, into something closer to a muted physical resignation. A state in which the body's own response to extreme caloric deficit had reduced the emotional intensity of the fear, even as it had reduced the physical capacity for other forms of response. The specific physiological feature of severe starvation, the reduction of emotional responsiveness that the body produces as a consequence of withdrawing energy from non-survival functions, was both a mercy and a danger in the siege context. It reduced the acute suffering of the fear while also reducing the survivor's capacity for the kinds of social connection and mutual support that the siege's survival required. Fact number 37. Parachute riggers, the men and women who packed the parachutes on which airborne soldiers and aircrew survival depended, worked within a specific occupational fear context whose normalization had directly lethal consequences if it proceeded too far. The fear of making an error, of packing a parachute incorrectly and thereby killing the person who would depend on it, was a form of occupational fear that the parachute packing profession treated not as something to be normalized away, but as something to be maintained at a functional level as a component of the work's quality assurance. The specific challenge of parachute rigger fear management was the prevention of the normalization that sustained repetitive work tends to produce, the gradual reduction of attentiveness through familiarity that was in most occupational contexts an acceptable and even beneficial adaptation, but that in the context of parachute packing was a direct threat to the quality of the product and the safety of its user. Parachute packing protocols, the double-checking procedures, the supervisor sign-off requirements, the deliberate variation of tasks to prevent the attention degradation of pure repetition, were designed specifically to maintain the level of attentive caution that the work required against the natural tendency of the normalization process to reduce it. The management of parachute rigger fear was, uniquely among wartime occupational contexts, a management aimed at preventing normalization rather than achieving it. Fact number 38. The fear of aerial bombardment was normalized differently in different social classes of British civilians, a difference that the sociological surveys of mass observation documented in considerable detail, reflecting the specific ways in which social class shaped both the material experience of bombing and the cultural resources available for managing the fear it produced. Working-class civilians in the East End of London, who bore the greatest proportional share of the bombing's physical effects, normalised their fear within a cultural tradition of communal resilience and practical stoicism that the specific social organisation of working-class urban life supported and reinforced. The street, the shelter, the pub, the local institutions of working-class community life, these provided collective frameworks for fear normalization that the more individualistic social organization of middle-class suburban life did not replicate in the same form. Middle-class civilians normalized their fear through different mechanisms: the cultural resource of British understatement, the garden maintained as a domain of personal control amid the larger uncontrollability of the raids, the letter writing and diary keeping that gave the fear a private expressive outlet. Both normalizations were genuine and both were effective, but they operated through different mechanisms and produced different social expressions of the same underlying psychological process, illustrating the general truth that fear normalization is always shaped by the specific cultural resources available to the people achieving it. Fact number 39. The specific fear of capture, which for different categories of wartime combatant carried radically different implications, from the relatively predictable prisoner of war experience of Western Allied soldiers to the near-certain torture and death that capture meant for SOE agents or Jewish partisans, was normalized in ways that reflected these radical differences in the likely consequences of the feared event. For British and American soldiers fighting in the European theatre against German forces who broadly observed the Geneva Conventions in the Western theatre, the fear of capture could be normalized through the development of a working understanding of prisoner of war conditions that, while not comfortable, were survivable and predictable. For Jewish partisans, SOE agents, and Soviet soldiers, for whom capture typically meant torture, brutal treatment, and death, the normalization of capture fear took a completely different form. One that was less about coming to terms with a manageable outcome and more about the development of a specific fatalism regarding an outcome that was acknowledged as essentially unsurvivable. This fatalistic normalization, the acceptance of death as the likely consequence of capture, as a means of managing the fear of capture, was one of the most psychologically demanding forms of fear management in the entire war, and its achievement by the people who were required to operate under these conditions was one of the less visible and less celebrated forms of wartime courage. Fact number 40. By the final year of the war in Europe, the civilians of bombed German cities had developed a relationship with the air raid that was in its outward behavioral expression one of the most complete normalizations of extreme danger documented in the entire conflict. Contemporary observers, military officers, journalists, and relief workers who entered German cities in the war's final months consistently noted the matter-of-fact efficiency with which civilian populations managed the raids that continued through the final weeks of the war. The shelter routines were practiced with a competence that spoke of years of repetition. The post-raid emergence and damage assessment were conducted with a practical organization refined through hundreds of previous experiences. The emotional register of civilian behavior during and immediately after raids was, by the accounts of outside observers, remarkably flat, not the numbed shock of people overwhelmed by something too large to absorb, but the organized efficiency of people whose bodies and minds had been trained, through years of repeated experience, to manage this specific event with the minimum expenditure of emotional energy compatible with effective action. The German civilian normalization of air raid fear was, in its behavioral expression, one of the most complete and most practically effective in the entire wartime record, achieved at a cost in accumulated psychological damage and physical exhaustion that the efficiency of the behavioral adaptation concealed but did not eliminate. Fact number 41. Something shifts in a person when fear stops arriving as a shock and begins arriving as a familiar companion. For tank crews fighting across the hedgerows of Normandy in the summer of 1944, that shift happened gradually over weeks of relentless claustrophobic combat. The inside of a Sherman tank was a world of compressed sound and vibration, where the smell of cordite, engine oil, and hot metal became simply the smell of a working day. Crews who survived long enough reported that the particular dread of anti-tank fire, that hollow ringing clang against the hull, lost its ability to paralyze. It became instead a signal, a trigger for action rather than a freeze. Veterans described how their hands moved automatically to their positions even before conscious thought caught up. Psychologists studying these accounts later noted that the normalization was not the absence of fear but the transformation of it. Fear compressed into a narrow band of heightened function. The emotional cost, however, was invisible and cumulative. Men who appeared perfectly composed during combat often found, months or years after the war, that ordinary sounds, a car backfiring, a door slamming, sent them straight back inside that hull. The normalization had been efficient, but it was never truly complete. Fact number 42. Across the rooftops of wartime London, a quiet army of fire watchers spent night after night scanning for incendiary bombs, their fear slowly restructured by repetition into something closer to professional alertness. These were ordinary civilians, shopkeepers, teachers, retired civil servants, whose role placed them directly in the path of the Blitz. In the early months, accounts describe racing heartbeats, trembling hands, and near paralysis during raids. But as the months accumulated, something changed. The darkness became familiar. The sequence of sounds, distant drone, rising wail of sirens, the sharp crack of anti-aircraft guns, became a predictable grammar rather than an unknown threat. Fire watchers developed their own informal routines, their own language for different types of falling debris, their own quiet humor about close calls. Researchers studying their diaries found a consistent pattern. The language of fear gradually gave way to the language of craft. By mid-1941, many entries read less like accounts of terror and more like the notes of a professional managing a familiar, difficult task. The fear had not vanished. It had simply been absorbed into competence, pressed down beneath the weight of accumulated experience until it no longer rose to the surface of conscious thought. Fact number 43. There is a particular quality to waiting for an air raid that differs from the raid itself. A slow, anticipatory dread that some civilians found harder to manage than the actual event. In wartime Naples, which suffered over 200 Allied bombing raids between 1940 and 1944, residents described an exhausting cycle of alertness and release that wore the nervous system down far more than any single raid. The philosopher and diarist Curzio Malaparte, writing from Naples during this period, noted that civilians had developed a kind of split-screen consciousness, one layer going about daily life normally, another layer permanently tuned to the sky. Over time, this divided awareness became so habitual that many residents reported difficulty switching it off even during long stretches of relative calm. Neurologists studying post-war survivors recognized this as a form of hypervigilance. The nervous system trained so thoroughly to scan for threat that it could no longer fully relax. The normalization was therefore double-edged. It allowed daily life to continue. It reduced the acute spike of terror during raids, but it also permanently elevated the baseline of physiological arousal. For many Neapolitan civilians, this elevated baseline outlasted the war by decades, surfacing in sleep disturbance, startled responses, and a persistent difficulty with the sensation of quiet. Fact number 44. Among the most psychologically studied groups of World War II are the airborne troops who made repeated combat jumps, and what emerges from their accounts is a nuanced picture of fear becoming stratified rather than simply disappearing. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the United States Army conducted major operations in Sicily, Normandy, the Netherlands, and the Ardennes, meaning that experienced men had jumped into combat multiple times under vastly different conditions. Veterans consistently reported that the first jump, even in training, produced raw, unfiltered terror. By the second or third combat jump, something had changed. The fear was still present, but it had been organized. Men reported a narrowing of focus, a kind of tunnel that excluded everything except the task immediately in front of them. Chaplains attached to airborne units noted that pre-jump prayer became less frantic over time, shifting from desperate bargaining to something quieter and more resolved. Psychologists later described this as the development of a fear scaffold, a mental architecture built from prior experience that gave each new moment of terror a familiar shape, making it less disorienting even when it remained intense. The scaffold did not remove the fear. It simply meant that a man no longer had to build his response from nothing, because he had been here before. Fact number 45. For the women who served as nurses aboard hospital ships in the Pacific, fear arrived not in the sharp burst familiar to combat soldiers but in a slow, sustained pressure that built over months of continuous exposure to catastrophic injury. Hospital ships like the USS Comfort and the AHS Centaur operated in actively contested waters, and the nurses aboard them understood clearly that the white paint and red crosses offered no guarantee of safety. The Centaur was sunk by a Japanese submarine in May 1943, killing 268 people. Over time, the nurses developed a form of emotional organization that their own letters and diaries describe with remarkable consistency. The fear of the ship being struck became background, lodged somewhere beneath the demands of immediate patient care. What took much longer to normalize was the sight of injury itself, the particular vocabulary of wounds that the Pacific War produced. Senior nurses reported that it took newer colleagues an average of 3 to 4 weeks before they could work through a full shift without experiencing acute distress at what they were seeing. After that period, something shifted. The distress did not vanish, but it was rerouted, held in a separate compartment that could be opened carefully, in private, and then sealed again so that the work could continue. Fact number 46. In the mountains of occupied Yugoslavia, partisan fighters developed a relationship with fear that their commanders explicitly tried to shape through ideology, discipline, and shared experience. Josip Broz Tito's partisans were a diverse force: Serbs, Croats, Slovens, Macedonians, Bosnians, united by a common resistance to occupation and a shared exposure to brutal reprisals. Fear of capture was the dominant terror, because capture by German or Ustaše forces frequently meant torture and public execution. Yet accounts from partisan veterans describe a gradual restructuring of that fear into something that functioned more like tactical caution than existential dread. The key, many veterans noted, was the collective. Fear experienced alone, in silence, tended to grow. Fear shared openly in a unit, acknowledged, discussed, even laughed at, remained manageable. Political commissars within partisan units played a deliberate role in this process, framing fear as a rational response to real danger rather than a personal weakness, and using discussion to prevent it from becoming isolation. Post-war psychological research on resistance fighters across occupied Europe consistently found that collective emotional processing, the simple act of naming and sharing fear within a trusted group, was among the most effective natural mechanisms for preventing fear from becoming incapacitating. The partisans, without formal psychological training, had arrived at this understanding through necessity. Fact number 47. Civilian postal workers in bombed British cities occupy a quietly remarkable chapter in the history of fear normalization. Their job required them to continue deliveries through damaged streets, past collapsed buildings, and across routes that had changed overnight due to fresh bomb damage. In the early months of the Blitz, postal workers' accounts described the genuine difficulty of approaching a street they had walked 100 times and finding it suddenly unrecognizable, the emotional disorientation of familiar geography made strange. But the General Post Office's internal records from 1941 and 1942 show an extraordinary pattern. Delivery completion rates remained consistently high throughout the bombing campaign, and absenteeism, while elevated in the first weeks of the Blitz, fell back to near pre-war levels within months. The workers themselves attributed this to a stubborn form of professional pride, a refusal to let the bombs rewrite what the job meant. What is psychologically interesting is how this professional framing functioned as a fear regulator. By placing the daily walk through destruction inside a professional identity rather than a personal one, postal workers were able to approach damaged streets as a logistical challenge rather than a frightening experience. The route had changed, the job had not, and the job, familiar and purposeful, carried them through. Fact number 48. For the signal operators who maintained communication lines between forward units and command posts, often stringing wire across open ground under fire, fear became inseparable from movement, and movement became the antidote to fear. American, British, and Soviet signals units all produced accounts that describe a consistent psychological pattern. The moment of leaving cover and moving into exposed terrain was the peak of terror, but once moving, once occupied with the physical and technical demands of the task, fear receded into functional urgency. Veterans of this work often described the return journey, after the wire had been laid or the brake repaired, as carrying a specific, almost chemical relief, a flood of feeling that had been deferred during the task itself. The signal operators were not braver than other soldiers. They had simply discovered, through accumulated experience, that action was a more reliable fear regulator than waiting. The hardest moment was always the pause before moving. Once the body was committed to the task, the fear, though present, lost its grip on decision-making and settled instead into the background hum of heightened but functional alertness. Fact number 49. The experience of air raid wardens in London reveals something important about how social roles shaped the normalization of fear. Wardens were civilians, mostly men over military age, but also women, whose job placed them at the exact point of impact during raids. The street, the rubble, the moment immediately after a bomb fell. In the early weeks of the Blitz, warden diaries record the full spectrum of acute fear: shaking, nausea, an overwhelming urge to find shelter. But the role itself was a powerful psychological regulator. Wardens were expected to be visible, calm, and directive, to be the person others looked to for reassurance. This expectation, externally imposed, created an internal regulation pressure. You could not visibly panic when a frightened family was looking to you for guidance. Over time, meeting that expectation repeatedly built a genuine internal resource. The performance of calm, sustained long enough, and consistently enough, began to produce something functionally close to actual calm. Post-war studies of civil defense workers found this to be one of the most consistent findings across different countries. Individuals given clear, socially visible roles during crisis normalized fear significantly faster than those without defined roles. The responsibility was not a burden placed on top of fear. It was paradoxically one of the most effective tools available for managing it. Fact number 50. In the Pacific Island campaigns, American Marines encountered a specific environmental fear that had no parallel in European theaters: the jungle itself. Dense vegetation, limited visibility, unfamiliar sounds, and an enemy that had mastered concealment created a landscape that seemed actively hostile in a way that open terrain did not. Early accounts from Guadalcanal describe Marines firing at sounds, at shadows, at the movement of leaves. Fear translated directly into uncontrolled action, but over weeks and months, a process of environmental learning reshaped that fear. Veterans describe developing what some called jungle hearing, a calibration of attention that could distinguish threatening sounds from the constant ambient noise of a living forest. The rustle of a human body moving through undergrowth was different from the sound of wind or animals, and experience taught the difference in a way that no training manual could fully convey. By the later island campaigns, experienced Marine units moved through jungle with a quality of attention that combined alertness with economy. They were not calm in any ordinary sense, but they were no longer afraid of the environment itself. The jungle had become a known quantity, its fears catalogued and understood. What remained was the fear of the enemy within it, focused and specific rather than diffuse and all-encompassing. Fact number 51. Among civilian populations in occupied Eastern Europe, the normalization of fear took on dimensions that researchers have found difficult to frame within ordinary psychological models, because the threat being normalized was not occasional danger but the continuous possibility of annihilation. In occupied Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, civilians lived under occupation policies that included mass shootings, forced deportation, and deliberate starvation. That such conditions produced fear normalization at all seems almost incomprehensible. And yet survivor testimonies consistently describe a psychological adaptation that allowed daily life to continue. What emerges from these accounts is a form of compartmentalization so total that it amounts to a parallel consciousness, one part of the mind conducting daily tasks, maintaining relationships, making small plans, another part holding the knowledge of what was happening and what might happen, sealed off sufficiently to allow the first part to function. Psychologists studying survivor testimonies have called this dissociative adaptation, not a pathology in the circumstances but a necessary cognitive strategy for maintaining function under conditions that would otherwise produce complete psychological collapse. The cost became visible only after liberation, when the sealed compartment could no longer be maintained, and the accumulated weight of what had been held there emerged, often devastatingly, into conscious experience. Fact number 52. Naval officers responsible for navigating through minefields, a task that fell to destroyers and minesweepers operating in the North Sea, the Mediterranean and Pacific approaches, developed a highly specific form of fear normalization built around precision and procedure. The danger was invisible, present in water that looked identical to safe water, which meant that the ordinary human strategy of reading the environment for threat cues was entirely useless. In response, officers developed an intensified procedural discipline. Every chart consulted twice, every coordinate verified independently, every deviation from a swept channel logged immediately. Veterans of this work described the psychological effect of this proceduralism as something close to the suppression of imagination, the part of the mind that, if allowed to run freely, would picture in vivid detail what a mine detonating beneath the hull would mean. The procedures were not merely practical, they were psychological. By filling attention completely with verifiable concrete tasks, they prevented the fear from finding the mental space it needed to expand into incapacitating imagery. Post-war interviews with minesweeper crews consistently reported that the officers who coped best were those who had most thoroughly subordinated imaginative rumination to procedural focus, not because they were less sensitive, but because they had learned through experience where their attention needed to go. Fact number 53. The experience of fear normalization among civilians in wartime Singapore, under Japanese occupation between 1942 and 1945, was shaped profoundly by the racial hierarchies that the occupiers imposed and enforced. Chinese Singaporeans faced the most acute and sustained threat, particularly in the aftermath of Suk Ching, the systematic massacre of Chinese civilians that killed between 25,000 and 50,000 people in February and March 1942. For Chinese families who survived this period, the normalization of fear was inseparable from the normalization of surveillance, knowing that one's ethnicity itself constituted a threat. Learning to move through public space with a particular kind of controlled invisibility. Survivor accounts describe the development of a social performance so thoroughgoing that it became automatic, a recalibration of body language, speech, and daily routine designed to minimize visibility. The psychological burden of this performance was enormous and rarely acknowledged in post-war accounts, where emphasis typically fell on material hardship rather than the sustained cognitive and emotional labor of managing identity under conditions of racial persecution. What is clear from later testimonies is that this normalization did not produce resilience in the sense of reduced distress. It produced endurance, the capacity to continue functioning under conditions of fear that never truly diminished, only became more familiar. Fact number 54. Among the less documented experiences of fear normalization in World War II are those of the merchant sailors who crewed the supply ships of the Allied convoys, men who were technically civilians carrying no weapons, operating ships that were slow, heavily loaded, and deeply vulnerable to submarine attack. The Atlantic crossing carried a statistical mortality rate that for certain periods of the war exceeded that of most frontline military branches. Between 1939 and 1945, more than 30,000 Allied merchant sailors were killed at sea. What distinguished their experience of fear from that of military personnel was the absence of institutional support mechanisms, no unit cohesion built through shared training, no military command structure providing psychological scaffolding, no official acknowledgement of their particular courage. Yet accounts from merchant sailors describe a normalization process that was in its essentials similar to that reported by military personnel. The gradual reclassification of danger from the unthinkable to the known, the development of informal rituals and dark humor, the compression of fear into a narrow professional alertness. What was different was the loneliness of it, the sense that their normalization was self-engineered, built without institutional support, from raw experience alone. Many merchant sailors returned after the war to find that their service was not formally recognized for decades, a bureaucratic invisibility that mirrored the psychological invisibility of the fear they had quietly managed throughout. Fact number 55. In the final months of the war in Europe, German civilians in cities such as Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne had endured years of increasingly heavy bombing, and the psychological state that many had reached by early 1945 defies easy categorization. It was not courage, not resignation, and not the absence of fear. It was something more like emotional exhaustion that had passed through fear and come out the other side into a flat, depleted state that some survivors described as not caring anymore. Historian Richard Evans, drawing on extensive civilian diaries and post-war testimony, describes this state as a kind of terminal normalization. The adaptive mechanisms that had allowed civilians to function through years of raids had been so thoroughly depleted that they could no longer mount even the emotional response of fear. What remained was a numb, mechanical continuation of daily routine, waking, eating whatever was available, going to whatever shelter still stood, returning. This terminal state was itself a psychological warning sign that went largely unrecognized at the time, because it resembled composure from the outside. Inside, it reflected a nervous system that had been driven past its adaptive limits and had simply stopped responding. The post-war recovery of German civilians was shaped in part by how deep this depletion had gone. Fact number 56. Code breakers and intelligence analysts at Bletchley Park experienced a form of fear normalization that was cognitive rather than physical, a slow acclimatization to the knowledge of catastrophe. Unlike soldiers whose fear was visceral and immediate, Bletchley's staff worked at a remove from danger that nonetheless placed them inside some of the most disturbing information of the war. Reading decoded German naval signals during the worst of the Battle of the Atlantic meant confronting, in cold numerical detail, the rate at which men were dying in water. Processing Luftwaffe communications meant knowing the target of a raid before it happened and understanding clearly the limits of what could be done with that knowledge. New recruits to Bletchley reported a period of acute psychological distress, not the fear of personal danger, but a different and in some ways more corrosive anxiety, the knowledge of harm arriving ahead of the harm itself. Over time, and through a process that the Bletchley community managed largely through social bonds, dark humor, and the intellectual absorptions of the work, many staff developed a professional detachment that allowed them to process terrible information without being destroyed by it. This detachment was neither heartlessness nor indifference. It was a learned and costly skill, the ability to hold devastating knowledge at a functional distance while continuing to work with it precisely and effectively. Fact number 57. The ground crews of bomber airfields, the mechanics, armorers and support staff who serviced aircraft between operations, occupied a particular psychological position in the fear landscape of the air war. They were close enough to the danger to understand it intimately. They patched the holes in returning aircraft. They noted the crews who did not return. They prepared the same planes for the next operation. Yet they were not themselves in the aircraft. This distance created its own distinctive form of fear, not the acute terror of combat, but a sustained low-level dread on behalf of others, a vicarious fear that had no outlet in action. Accounts from RAF ground crews described the normalization of this feeling as something quite different from the normalization reported by aircrew. There was no task focus in the cockpit to redirect it, no immediate survival demand to compress it. Instead, ground crews described developing a kind of protective emotional withdrawal, learning not to become too attached to specific crews, not to follow the individual fates of the men they worked alongside too closely, because the emotional cost of doing so was unsustainable over months and years. This protective withdrawal was functional and rational, but it also meant that many ground crew veterans emerged from the war carrying a form of grief that had never been fully felt, a cumulative deferred mourning for men whose loss they had witnessed but never fully allowed themselves to feel. Fact number 58. Among Soviet soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front, the normalization of fear occurred within a military culture that officially denied its existence. The Red Army's political infrastructure, its network of commissars and political officers, promoted a doctrine of fearlessness that treated any admission of fear as ideologically suspect, even potentially criminal. This created a distinctive situation in which fear normalization happened not through acknowledgement and shared processing, as it did in many Allied units, but through suppression enforced by social and political pressure. Veterans of the Eastern Front, particularly those who spoke candidly in interviews conducted after the Soviet Union's collapse, described a kind of double consciousness, an internal experience of fear that was real and continuous, and an external performance of composure that was mandatory. The normalization that resulted was therefore not the genuine transformation of fear into manageable alertness, but rather the perfection of a performance, an external composure that became so practiced and so automatic that it began to feel, from the inside, something close to actual fearlessness. The long-term cost of this form of normalization was severe. Soviet veterans had no cultural or institutional framework for processing the fear they had officially never been permitted to experience, and the psychological consequences, expressed in rates of alcoholism, domestic violence, and social withdrawal among veterans, were profound and long-lasting. Fact number 59. Children who grew up in wartime Britain between 1939 and 1945, particularly those who spent the entire war in bombed cities rather than being evacuated, represent one of the most studied groups for the long-term effects of childhood fear normalization. Psychologist John Bowlby, whose foundational work on attachment theory was partly shaped by his observations of wartime children, noted that children who remained with their mothers during the Blitz showed markedly better psychological outcomes than those who were separated and evacuated, even when the home environment included genuine physical danger. The reason, Bowlby argued, was that the mother's presence regulated the child's fear response. The child's nervous system calibrated its threat assessment partly through the emotional signals of the primary attachment figure. Children who remained in London with their mothers normalized fear within the context of a secure relationship. Children who were evacuated, removed from that relational context and placed in unfamiliar environments with unfamiliar adults, experienced a different and in some respects more damaging disruption. Not the normalization of specific fears, but the destabilization of the relational foundation from which fear regulation itself operates. The implications of Bowlby's wartime observations extended far beyond the war, contributing to a fundamental reorientation in our understanding of child development that shaped pediatric medicine, social policy, and psychological practice for generations. Fact number 60. By the final year of the war in the Pacific, American servicemen who had fought from Guadalcanal through the successive island campaigns had accumulated an experience of fear normalization that was, in its depth and duration, almost without precedent in military history. Men who had first gone ashore in 1942 had spent nearly 3 years in an environment of sustained, intermittent but never absent danger. The psychological state they had reached by 1944 and 1945 was one that military psychiatrists observing them found difficult to categorize. It was not composure in any ordinary sense, it was not indifference. Veterans of the later Pacific campaigns described a quality of attention that was simultaneously utterly calm on the surface and completely, permanently alert underneath, a state that combined the appearance of relaxation with a nervous system that had been trained so thoroughly in vigilance that it could no longer produce genuine rest. Military psychiatrists called this combat exhaustion, but the veterans themselves described something more paradoxical. A state in which they were no longer afraid in any conscious sense, and yet in which they were never, in any meaningful way, at ease. The fear had been so thoroughly absorbed into the fabric of their daily functioning that it had become indistinguishable from normal experience. Not gone, but transformed into the texture of a self that had been rebuilt, slowly and without anyone fully noticing, around the demands of sustained survival. Fact number 61. Somewhere in the rhythm of a long war, the human body begins making decisions that the conscious mind has not yet caught up with. For anti-aircraft gun crews stationed across Britain, Malta, and North Africa, this biological precedence became one of the defining features of their experience. These crews, many of them women serving in the British Auxiliary Territorial Service by 1941, operated guns that required coordinated, multi-person technical work under conditions of noise, disorientation, and incoming fire. In the early months of service, crew members described a fractured quality to their performance, hands moving to correct positions while the mind was still processing the sound of the incoming aircraft. Over time, this fractured quality resolved into something seamless. The body and the task merged. Drills that had initially required conscious attention became entirely automatic, freeing the conscious mind to monitor the wider situation rather than manage individual movements. What veterans described as the point at which fear became manageable was precisely this point of automation, when the body could be trusted to do the work without being directed, and the mind could release its grip on procedure and attend instead to the larger picture. The emotional relief of that release was, by multiple accounts, profound. Not the absence of fear, but the discovery that fear no longer needed to be fought because competence had quietly replaced it as the dominant experience. Fact number 62. There is a quality of dread specific to those who knew professionally and in advance what was coming, and among the clearest examples in World War II are the meteorologists attached to Allied operational commands. These were men and women whose job required them to understand, with whatever accuracy the science of the time permitted, what the atmosphere was about to do over contested territory. The weather briefing officer for a bomber group knew, the night before an operation, that the crews being briefed would fly into conditions he had calculated and described. If his forecast was wrong, if cloud cover was heavier than predicted, if winds shifted the formation off course, the consequences were measured in aircraft and lives. Over time, meteorologists developed a professional normalization of this responsibility that was built not around emotional distance but around methodological rigor. Every observation checked twice, every model run verified against raw data, every briefing delivered with careful qualification about uncertainty, the fear of being wrong, of sending men into conditions miscalculated, never fully normalized. Veterans of this work described it as the one fear that remained sharp throughout the war, because it was attached not to personal danger but to professional responsibility for others. It was in that sense a fear that resisted the usual mechanisms of adaptation, because it was rooted not in survival instinct but in conscience. Fact number 63. The experience of Italian civilians caught between retreating German forces and advancing Allied armies between 1943 and 1945 produced a form of fear normalization shaped by a specific and brutal unpredictability. Unlike civilians in countries under stable occupation, where the rules of danger, however unjust, were at least consistent, Italian civilians in the combat zone faced a threat landscape that changed week by week as the front moved north. A village that had adapted to German occupation found itself suddenly in the middle of artillery exchanges, then briefly liberated, then reoccupied, then liberated again. German troops retreating under pressure were among the most dangerous forces for civilians to be near. Desperate, capable of summary reprisals, and under no consistent command restraint, Allied forces brought their own dangers. Artillery that did not distinguish between military and civilian structures, supply convoys that requisitioned food and animals, and soldiers whose relationship to local civilians varied enormously by unit and commander. What Italian civilian accounts describe is not a single normalization of a single fear but a rapid, exhausting serial adaptation, learning the specific danger profile of each new situation, developing the particular caution it required, and then having the entire landscape shift again before that caution could settle into a reliable routine. Fact number 64. Among the more unusual case studies in wartime fear normalization are the experiences of war correspondents embedded with frontline units across multiple theaters. These were civilians, journalists, photographers, radio reporters, who had voluntarily placed themselves in the path of combat without the psychological scaffolding that military training provides. Figures like Ernie Pyle, Martha Gellhorn, and Marguerite Higgins documented the war at close range, and their own writings provide a rare self-reflective account of fear normalization from the outside of the military machine. Pyle, who covered campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and the Pacific before his death on Iwo in April 1945, wrote with unusual candor about how his fear changed over years of frontline coverage. Early dispatches describe acute physical fear, the involuntary duck at the sound of shells, the difficulty of controlling breathing during bombardments. Later writing describes something quieter and in some ways more troubling, a state in which the signs of fear were still present physiologically but no longer registered consciously, a dissociation between body and awareness that Pyle himself found disquieting. He wrote in one of his final columns that the men who frightened him most were those who had stopped feeling frightened. It is one of the war's quiet ironies that this observation, written shortly before his death, applied as much to himself as to the soldiers he was describing. Fact number 65. The normalization of fear within resistance networks in occupied France created a social phenomenon that post-war historians found both remarkable and sobering. Members of networks such as the CART, Prosper, and stockbroker circuits of the Special Operations Executive operated under conditions where the threat of arrest, torture, and execution was not theoretical but statistically probable. The majority of SOE agents sent to France were eventually captured. Yet the accounts of those who survived describe a progressive psychological shift over months of clandestine activity that moved from acute disabling terror toward a functional operational alertness. The shift was built partly on small victories, a message successfully passed, a contact safely made, a checkpoint negotiated without incident. Each small success deposited something in what veterans described as an internal account, a growing reserve of evidence that it was possible to function effectively in this environment. What the accounts also make clear, however, is how fragile this normalization was. The arrest of a single key contact, the discovery that a safe house had been compromised, could dissolve months of careful psychological construction in hours, returning the agent to an acute fear state that had to be rebuilt from scratch. The normalization was never permanent. It was always, at its core, provisional. Fact number 66. The domestic servants who remained in employment in occupied Paris throughout the German occupation occupy a peculiar and rarely examined position in the history of wartime fear. Many of these individuals worked in households that had been requisitioned by German officers, or continued to serve French families navigating the complex terrain of accommodation and resistance. Their position was one of profound social ambiguity, present in rooms where sensitive conversations happened, invisible in the way that domestic workers are invisible to those they serve, and acutely aware that their own safety depended on a careful management of what they heard, what they appeared not to hear, and what they allowed themselves to show. Accounts from this group, many recovered through post-war oral history projects in France, describe a fear normalization built entirely around the performance of professional neutrality. Moving quietly, anticipating needs, maintaining an expression of attentive blankness that revealed nothing. For those who served in households with German officers, this performance was sustained not for hours but for years. The psychological toll was enormous, and it was rarely acknowledged in the post-war period, when public attention focused on more visible forms of resistance and suffering. Fact number 67. Across the vast geography of the Soviet Union's wartime interior, the cities and industrial towns far from the front lines, factory workers producing tanks, artillery and ammunition lived under a fear of a different kind from the fear of combat, but one that proved no less persistent or demanding to normalize. In the Ural factories and the relocated plants of Siberia and Central Asia, workers operated under conditions of extreme physical hardship, 12 to 16-hour shifts, inadequate food rations, unheated workshops in temperatures that could fall below -30 degrees Celsius in winter. The fear that permeated this environment was not the fear of immediate physical danger, but the fear of failure, of not meeting production quotas which under Soviet wartime law could be treated as sabotage, carrying consequences as severe as imprisonment or execution. Workers normalized this fear through a combination of exhaustion, sheer physical depletion that left insufficient mental resources for sustained anxiety, and collective identification with the war effort. Propaganda framing of factory workers' frontline service was not simply manipulation. For many workers it provided a genuine psychological anchor, a sense that their suffering had meaning and direction. The normalization was real but narrow. Fear of failure remained a constant undercurrent, and the post-war accounts of Soviet factory workers describe it with a uniformity that suggests it never fully receded, even after the pressures that produced it were gone. Fact number 68. There is a form of fear unique to those who receive orders to do things they know may kill others, and among the clearest World War II examples are the experiences of naval officers responsible for depth charge attacks on submarines. The mathematics of anti-submarine warfare were stark. A depth charge pattern was calculated to kill every living thing within a certain radius, and the men aboard a U-boat within that radius were known, professionally, to include sailors very similar to the men dropping the charges. In the early encounters, officers described an acute moral discomfort alongside the operational fear, a doubling of distress that made the task harder than simple danger would have. Over time, and through a process that veterans described with some difficulty in post-war interviews, this moral component was progressively separated from the operational one. The professional task, detecting, targeting, attacking, was isolated in attention from its human content and addressed as a technical problem. The moral weight did not disappear. Veterans were consistent in reporting that it returned, sometimes with considerable force, in quieter moments after the action was over. but during the action itself, it was managed through the same task-focus mechanisms that regulated physical fear in other contexts. The normalization of this particular fear therefore involved not just the management of personal danger, but the temporary bracketing of moral conscience, a psychological maneuver whose costs only became fully apparent long after the war. Fact number 69. The experience of fear normalization among Jewish civilians hiding in concealment, in hidden annexes, false walls, underground bunkers, and forest refuges across occupied Europe, represents one of the most extreme cases in the entire wartime record. The most famous account, Anne Frank's diary, documents a process of fear normalization over more than 2 years of concealment in Amsterdam that is remarkable precisely because of how clearly it shows fear's dual capacity, to deaden and to intensify, sometimes within the same diary entry. Anne describes periods in which the fear of discovery had settled into a background condition that allowed for humor, intellectual curiosity, and genuine moments of joy. She also describes nights of acute terror when sounds from below stairs suggested a break-in, when each footstep carried a weight it should not have had to carry. What the diary captures, and what other accounts from hidden civilians confirm, is that fear normalization in concealment was never linear or stable. It did not progress from acute to managed in a smooth gradient. It oscillated, responsive to specific triggers, to the news reaching them from outside, to the emotional states of others in the concealment space. The normalization was real, but perpetually vulnerable, dependent on a quiet that was itself never guaranteed. Fact number 70. By the time the war in Europe reached its final months in early 1945, soldiers of all major combatant nations had been fighting in some cases for nearly 6 years. The psychological states they had reached through that duration of accumulated fear experience were unlike anything that military medicine had encountered before. Psychiatrists attached to Allied armies in Germany during the final advance documented a phenomenon they struggled to name. Veterans who had been through years of combat responded to the increasingly dangerous final phase of the war. Street fighting in German cities, river crossings under fire, clearing fortified positions, with a quality of professional efficiency that was, from the outside, indistinguishable from calm. Inside, as post-war interviews would reveal, the picture was more complex. Many veterans described having reached a state of emotional simplification, a reduction of the inner world to a small number of clear priorities, chief among them the survival of the men immediately around them, with all other emotional content stripped away or deferred. Fear was present but had been fully integrated into function. It no longer arrived as a separate experience to be managed, but had become part of the texture of awareness itself, woven so thoroughly into perception and response that its edges were no longer visible. This was not peace. It was a form of psychological completion, the end state of a process that had been running for years, whose full cost would only become apparent when at last the need for it was over. Fact number 71. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the soldiers and civilians who had spent years normalizing fear discovered something that none of them had been prepared for. The normalization did not simply reverse. The psychological architecture built so carefully and at such cost over years of sustained danger did not dismantle itself on receiving the news of peace. Veterans returning to Britain, the United States, Canada, and Australia described a disorienting mismatch between the world they were returning to and the internal world they were carrying. Streets that were safe felt threatening. Crowds that posed no danger triggered the same physiological alertness that had once kept them alive. Domestic sounds, a door slamming, a car engine backfiring, a child crying suddenly, activated nervous systems that had been trained for years to treat unexpected noise as a threat signal. Psychologists of the period lacked the conceptual vocabulary to describe what they were observing. The term post-traumatic stress disorder would not exist for another 4 decades. But the clinical notes from veterans' hospitals in 1945 and 1946 describe it with unmistakable clarity. The fear had normalized so deeply that it had become structural. It was no longer a response to external conditions but a permanent feature of the internal landscape. Peace had arrived on the outside. On the inside, for thousands of returning soldiers and civilians alike, the war continued to run, quiet, invisible, and entirely without an enemy to give it shape. Fact number 72. Among the overlooked populations in the history of wartime fear normalization are the interpreters and translators attached to Allied and Axis military units, individuals who operated at the intersection of languages and therefore at the intersection of dangers. Military interpreters in the Pacific were often Japanese Americans serving in the military intelligence service, men who translated captured documents, intercepted communications, and conducted prisoner interrogations in a theater where their physical appearance made them indistinguishable from the enemy they were helping to fight. The fear this created was of a particular and compound kind. The fear of combat shared with every soldier, combined with the fear of being killed by friendly fire from Allied troops who could not quickly distinguish a Japanese-American soldier from a Japanese combatant. Several veterans of the military intelligence service described incidents in which they had to be escorted by Caucasian soldiers specifically to prevent being shot by their own side. The normalization of this compound fear required a psychological flexibility that went beyond what most soldiers were asked to manage, holding in mind simultaneously the threat from the enemy and the threat from one's own forces, and finding a way to function effectively within that double exposure. That so many did so, and did so with distinction, is a measure of resilience that the historical record has only recently begun to acknowledge properly. Fact number 73. The role of animals in moderating fear normalization during World War II is a subject that military historians have generally treated as anecdotal, but which emerges with striking consistency across a wide range of personal accounts. Regimental mascots, dogs kept informally by units, cats adopted by ship's crews, and carrier pigeons tended by their handlers all appear repeatedly in soldier diaries and letters as sources of emotional grounding during periods of sustained fear. The psychological mechanism was not complex but was genuinely powerful. Animals responded to the present moment rather than to anticipated danger. Their calm, or in the case of animals reacting to incoming fire, their transparent and non-judgmental fear, provided a kind of emotional reference point that human social dynamics could not always supply. British destroyer crews kept cats whose behavior during submarine alerts was closely watched by sailors who trusted feline instinct more than their own rattled perceptions. American bomber crews brought dogs to airfields and described the ritual of seeing them before an operation as a genuine psychological anchor. Soviet cavalry units maintained bonds with horses that veterans described in terms usually reserved for human relationships. The normalization of fear was, in each of these cases, partly a communal project, and the animals were quiet but consistent contributors to that community, present without agenda, responsive without judgment, and alive in a way that reminded the humans around them, in the middle of a vast machinery of death, what ordinary life felt like. Fact number 74. The civilian populations of cities that were repeatedly bombed but never fully destroyed, as distinct from cities that were completely leveled, developed a relationship with partial destruction that psychologists have found deeply instructive. London is the clearest example, a city that sustained severe damage across large areas but retained enough of its pre-war geography and social fabric to allow continuity of identity. The presence of destroyed buildings alongside intact ones created a specific psychological dynamic. The ruins became integrated into the normal visual landscape, not ignored exactly but incorporated, domesticated, made familiar by daily exposure. Children played in them, neighbors walked past them each morning on the way to work, markets operated in their shadows. This integration of destruction into normality is a form of environmental fear normalization that operated on a collective rather than individual scale, a shared recalibration of what the city was, accomplished not through any deliberate process but through the accumulated daily decision of millions of people to continue living in and moving through a damaged but surviving urban space. Post-war urban planners and architects grappled with what to do with London's ruins, and found to their surprise that many residents resisted their removal, not from sentiment but from a deeper psychological attachment to the evidence of survival that those ruins represented. Fact number 75. Among the most quietly significant contributors to fear normalization on the home front were the women who ran households in the absence of husbands and fathers, who were therefore responsible not only for managing their own fear but for regulating the fear of their children. This task, performed without training, without institutional support, and without public acknowledgement of its psychological dimension, was among the most demanding of the war. Child psychologists studying wartime records have consistently found that a mother's visible emotional regulation was the single most powerful predictor of a child's ability to normalize fear in bombed environments. Women who maintained outward composure during raids, who spoke calmly about absent fathers, who framed disruption as manageable and temporary, were providing their children with a live demonstration of fear regulation that shaped the children's own developing nervous systems. The cost to the women themselves was rarely counted. To perform composure reliably across months and years with inadequate sleep, reduced food, persistent anxiety about absent partners, and no acknowledged outlet for their own distress, required a form of sustained emotional labor that had no name and received no recognition. The generations of relatively psychologically stable children produced by these women are in a very real sense among the war's least visible achievements, built quietly, in the ordinary hours of ordinary days by people who were given no particular credit for what they were doing. Fact number 76. The experience of Gurkha soldiers serving with the British Army in North Africa, Italy and Burma provides one of the most distinctive examples of culturally shaped fear normalization in World War II. Gurkhas came from the hill regions of Nepal with a martial tradition that treated courage not as the absence of fear but as its willing embrace, a cultural framing that shaped the psychological experience of danger in ways that British officers serving alongside them consistently noted and struggled to fully understand. What British accounts describe as remarkable composure under fire was understood within Gurkha culture not as normalization, the gradual reduction of fear through repeated exposure, but as a different relationship with fear from the beginning. Fear was acknowledged, even honored, as evidence that the danger was real and therefore that the courage meeting it meant something. Veterans of units fighting alongside Gurkha regiments in Burma described the psychological effect of this cultural attitude as genuinely stabilizing. The presence of men who treated fear as a companion rather than an enemy subtly shifted the emotional climate of the unit. The normalization of fear, in this context, was not a process of habituation but of cultural permission, the collective agreement that fear was acceptable, expected, and compatible with complete effectiveness. This culturally embedded permission, modern military psychologists have argued, may be among the most reliable foundations for operational resilience that any military tradition has produced. Fact number 77. Alongside the large-scale psychological adaptations documented by military psychiatrists and post-war researchers, there existed an enormous body of small, private, individual strategies for managing fear that never made it into official records but survive in personal diaries, letters and oral histories. Soldiers carried particular objects, a pebble from a home garden, a child's drawing, a lock of hair, that functioned as physical anchors connecting the present moment of danger to a life that existed outside it. Civilians developed specific routines for shelter nights, the order in which things were done, the words spoken before the light went out, the particular way of arranging a blanket, that provided a micro-environment of predictability within the larger unpredictability of bombardment. A British woman's diary from 1941 describes making a cup of tea before every air raid warning in precisely the same sequence of movements, not because she particularly wanted tea, but because the sequence had become a ritual that told her nervous system that the situation was known, that she had been here before, and that she had survived. These individual strategies were rarely shared or compared. People were largely unaware that their neighbors were doing something similar, and yet they represent a grassroots psychology of fear management that was invented independently, in thousands of different forms, by people who had no access to professional support, no theoretical framework, but who had discovered, through simple necessity, something genuinely important about how human beings can maintain function when the world they are living in has become persistently, inescapably dangerous. Fact number 78. The normalization of fear among children who grew up in the Warsaw Ghetto, those who survived long enough to experience it, took place within conditions so extreme that describing it risks an inadvertent softening of what those conditions actually were. What the accounts of survivors and the testimonies collected by Emanuel Ringelblum's Oneg Shabbat archive make clear is that children in the ghetto developed a relationship with death and danger that was, from an outside perspective, devastating in its matter-of-factness. Children who witnessed killings in the street continued their activities with a speed of recovery that horrified adult observers who were themselves engaged in their own normalizing processes. Child survivors interviewed decades later described a quality of attention in their ghetto childhood that was simultaneously preternaturally alert and strangely detached, as though the ordinary emotional responses to what they were seeing had been routed around, bypassed by a system that could not afford the interruption they would have caused. Psychologists studying these testimonies have identified this as a form of childhood dissociative adaptation, a protective psychological response that preserved function at the cost of full emotional engagement with experience. The long-term consequences were complex and varied enormously between individuals. For some survivors, the detachment became a lifelong feature of emotional experience. For others, the emotions that had been bypassed in childhood surfaced later in life with a force and a vividness that bore no relationship to the circumstances that triggered them. Fact number 79. The soldiers who fought in the later stages of the Italian campaign, the grinding, attritional advance up the peninsula between 1943 and 1945, occupied a fear landscape that military historians have described as among the most psychologically wearing of any theater in the war. Unlike the mobile, fast-moving campaigns that capture popular imagination, the Italian front was characterized by slow advances against prepared defensive positions, repeated across mountains and rivers that provided the retreating Germans with a continuous series of natural defensive advantages. The fear associated with this environment was therefore not the acute, adrenaline-saturated terror of rapid maneuver, but a chronic, sustained dread with no clear horizon. There was always another ridge, always another river crossing, always another fortified village. Veterans of the Italian campaign describe a progressive emotional contraction over months of this kind of fighting, a narrowing of concern and connection until the circle of psychological investment had shrunk to the smallest possible unit, the men immediately around them, the ground immediately in front, the next few hours. This contraction was a form of fear normalization, but it was also a form of psychological self-protection that came at significant cost. The emotional range that had been compressed to manage the demands of the Italian front proved difficult to re-expand after the war. Many veterans returned to civilian life with an emotional economy that remained narrow, functional, contained, but stripped of the wider register that ordinary social and family life requires. Fact number 80. Across the entire span of World War II, in every theater and every population touched by the conflict, the normalization of fear followed patterns that modern psychology has come to recognize as deeply consistent with how human nervous systems respond to sustained threat. The specific content varied enormously. The jungle, the submarine, the hiding place, the bombed street, the factory, the code-breaking hut, the hospital ship. But the underlying process was remarkably similar. Initial acute disruption, gradual recalibration of the threat baseline, compression of fear into functional alertness, development of personal and collective rituals to support that compression, and the emergence of a new working equilibrium that allowed daily life, in some form, to continue. What the wartime record also makes clear, with a consistency that demands attention, is that this normalization was never free. Every adaptation had a cost, visible or invisible, immediate or deferred. The cost might be the emotional narrowing of the Italian veteran, the deferred grief of the RAF ground crew, the dissociative detachment of the ghetto child, the performance fatigue of the Soviet soldier, the permanent hypervigilance of the Neapolitan civilian. The human capacity for fear normalization is extraordinary. The wartime record demonstrates this beyond any doubt. But the wartime record demonstrates with equal clarity that the capacity is finite, that its exercise always leaves a mark, and that the mark, when it is not acknowledged, tends not to fade but simply to find other ways of making itself known. Fact number 81. Something that the official histories of World War II rarely capture is the specific moment when a person realized, with quiet surprise, that they had stopped being afraid in the way they once were. For many veterans and civilians, this realization arrived not during a dramatic event but in an ordinary one, a bomb falling nearby and the body simply continuing what it was doing, hands steady, breath even, the mind noting the explosion the way it might note a passing truck. A British ATS volunteer stationed near London described this moment in a 1943 letter to her sister with an almost apologetic bewilderment. She had expected to be frightened and had not been, and the absence of fear was itself briefly frightening, as though something important had been lost rather than gained. This paradox, the fear of losing fear, appears in enough wartime accounts across enough different cultures and contexts to constitute a genuine psychological phenomenon. Fear, after all, had been a reliable signal, a proof that the danger was real and that the person perceiving it was still sufficiently intact to respond. Its disappearance therefore carried an ambiguity that simple relief could not fully account for. What had been lost along with the fear? What else had been smoothed away in the same process? These were questions that most people did not have the language or the circumstances to ask during the war itself, but which surfaced, sometimes decades later, in the quiet of peacetime, when there was finally enough stillness to hear them. Fact number 82. The wartime experience of nurses working in the psychiatric wards of military hospitals, caring for soldiers whose fear normalization had broken down entirely, offered a particular and painful vantage point on the whole process. These nurses saw, at close range, what happened when the adaptive mechanisms failed. The men who could not sleep, who threw themselves to the floor at unexpected sounds, who wept without apparent cause, who stared at walls with an intensity that suggested they were seeing something other than the wall. What the psychiatric ward nurses also saw, and what their own accounts describe with a candor unusual for the period, was the mirror image of their patient's condition in their own daily experience. They were not breaking down, they were functioning, but the sustained exposure to acute psychological suffering was accumulating in them in ways that found no outlet in the professional culture of the time. Nurses were expected to be competent, calm, and supportive. There was no official space in which they could acknowledge that what they were witnessing was affecting them. Post-war studies of psychiatric ward nurses from the World War II period found elevated rates of anxiety and emotional exhaustion that persisted for years, the invisible cost of being the person who witnessed, without being permitted to share, the full consequence of what sustained fear could do to a human being. Fact number 83. The geography of fear normalization in World War II was not uniform, and one of its most striking variations appeared between urban and rural civilian populations. City dwellers in bombed urban centers normalized fear within a dense social environment. The close proximity of neighbors, the visibility of shared suffering, the constant sensory reinforcement of collective experience. Rural civilians in occupied territories faced a different and in some ways more isolating fear landscape. In the countryside of occupied France, Poland, the Netherlands, and Yugoslavia, the danger was often less continuous but more personalized. A patrol stopping at the farm gate, a neighbor's arrest, a requisition officer arriving unannounced. The fear in these encounters was not the diffuse, environmental fear of bombardment, but a focused, interpersonal fear with a specific human face. Normalizing this kind of fear required a different set of adaptations. The ability to meet the eyes of the threat, to speak to it, to perform normality in direct personal interaction rather than simply enduring it as an ambient condition. Rural resistance networks across occupied Europe developed this skill to an extraordinary degree. The ability to stand in a farmyard and converse with an armed soldier with apparent ease, every word and gesture calculated, the internal fear compressed below the level of any visible signal. This performance, sustained across years of occupation, was a form of courage that left very little trace in the official record. Fact number 84. The children who grew up in wartime Japan between 1941 and 1945 experienced a fear normalization shaped by a state apparatus that was arguably more total in its reach than any other combatant nation's. Japanese civilian life was saturated with a propaganda infrastructure that not only denied fear but actively reframed it as an emotion incompatible with correct national identity. Fear, within this framework, was not something to be managed or normalized. It was something to be erased through ideological commitment. Children were taught from the earliest school years that the proper response to danger was not fear but a calm, resolved acceptance rooted in service to the emperor. What survivor accounts from Japanese children of this period describe, however, is a more complex interior experience, an official emotional performance that diverged significantly from what was actually felt, and a learned capacity for maintaining this divergence that was itself psychologically costly. As American bombing intensified through 1944 and 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. The gap between the official emotional script and the lived reality became impossible to bridge. Children who had been taught that fear was ideologically impermissible now faced destruction on a scale that no ideological framework could contain. The psychological rupture that resulted was profound and lasting. Fact number 85. Among the World War II populations whose experience of fear normalization has received the least scholarly attention are the civilians of the Soviet Union's Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, who received millions of evacuees from the Western USSR and simultaneously contributed enormous numbers of soldiers to the Red Army. These populations experienced the war through a combination of demographic disruption, economic requisitioning, and the pervasive grief of absent and dying men, without the direct physical danger of bombardment or occupation that characterized the Western Soviet republics. Their fear was of a different kind, diffuse, ambient, attached not to an immediate physical threat, but to the vast, impersonal machinery of a war that was consuming people at a rate that defied ordinary comprehension. The normalization of this kind of fear, fear of loss rather than fear of direct harm, followed a different psychological trajectory from the combat or bombardment adaptations documented elsewhere. It was less dramatic and less visible, but survivor accounts describe a similar endpoint, a progressive dulling of acute distress into a chronic, low-level awareness of loss that became so continuous it ceased to register as a distinct emotional state and simply became the background condition of daily life. The fear of losing someone became eventually indistinguishable from ordinary experience, which is perhaps the most quietly devastating form of normalization that the war produced anywhere. Fact number 86. The reintegration of fear-normalized individuals back into peacetime civilian life was a process that neither governments nor communities had prepared for, and the friction it generated shaped Western societies for decades in ways that are only now being fully traced. In the United States, the image of the returning veteran as psychologically intact, ready to resume normal life, and grateful for peace was not merely a cultural preference but an active policy position. The veterans themselves, many of whom had spent years building internal psychological architectures perfectly calibrated for sustained danger and entirely unsuited to suburban domesticity, largely accepted this narrative in public while experiencing something very different in private. Alcohol consumption among returning American veterans rose sharply in the late 1940s. Rates of domestic conflict and marital breakdown were significantly elevated. A generation of children grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally inaccessible, men who had compressed their emotional range so thoroughly in service of survival that re-expanding it in peacetime proved enormously difficult. These consequences were not random. They were the predictable residue of a normalization process that had been extraordinarily effective at its wartime purpose and entirely unprepared for what would come after. The long, unacknowledged work of unwinding what years of sustained fear had built. Fact number 87. The Dyomchir, specific experience of fear normalization among women who served as secret agents in occupied Europe, particularly those recruited by the Special Operations Executive and the American Office of Strategic Services, has been documented in enough detail to allow some careful observations about how gender shaped the process. SOE women agents such as Noor Inayat Khan, Violette Sabo, and Odette Sansam operated in environments where the standard social assumptions about women, that they were less likely to be involved in resistance activity, less threatening to male authority, less deserving of scrutiny, provided a partial operational advantage while simultaneously placing them in situations of extreme personal vulnerability. The fear they carried was therefore shaped by a double exposure: the general fear of the resistance operative, and the specific fear of what capture meant for a woman in the hands of the Gestapo. Accounts from the agents who survived describe a normalization process that was in many respects indistinguishable from that reported by male agents. The gradual compression of acute fear into functional alertness, the development of social performance skills, the building of an internal reserve through accumulated small successes. What was different was the physical dimension of the specific fear, the knowledge of what torture and assault could mean, which proved more resistant to normalization than other categories of fear, and surfaced more persistently in the consciousness of women agents, even those who had developed high levels of operational effectiveness in every other respect. Fact number 88. The fear experienced by civilians during the immediate aftermath of bombing raids, the hours between the all-clear siren and the restoration of some version of normality, constitutes a distinct psychological phase that has received less attention than either the experience of the raid itself or the longer process of normalization across months and years. Accounts from London, Hamburg, Tokyo, and Manila all describe a quality of time in those immediate post-raid hours that was unlike ordinary experience in specific ways. The air carried a particular mixture of dust, smoke, and the chemical smell of explosive residue that became, for many survivors, one of the most persistent sensory memories of the war, a smell that decades later could trigger an immediate, involuntary return to those hours. The social behavior of the immediate aftermath was also distinctive, a suspension of normal social boundaries, a temporary democracy of distress in which class, age, and social status became briefly irrelevant, replaced by the simpler categories of injured and uninjured, housed and unhoused, found and missing. The fear normalization that took place in those hours was not the gradual, months-long process of baseline recalibration but something faster and more immediate, a rapid collective reassembly of the social world from its disrupted state, a practiced re-establishment of ordinary interaction that served as both a practical necessity and a psychological declaration that the ordinary world, despite everything, still existed and could be re-entered. Fact number 89. The question of what happened to fear normalization when the thing being feared finally came to pass, when the bomb hit the right house, when the telegram arrived, when the knock at the door was what it had always threatened to be, is one that psychological literature has addressed incompletely. But across a wide range of testimonies from different countries and different contexts, a pattern does emerge. Survivors consistently described the moment of actual catastrophe as carrying a paradoxical quality of unreality, a disconnection between the event and its emotional register that many found disturbing in retrospect. The fear that had been so thoroughly normalized, managed and contained for so long in anticipation of exactly this kind of blow, did not escalate into the overwhelming experience that its sustained management might have suggested was being held at bay. Instead, many survivors described a strange flatness, a functional clarity, a capacity for immediate practical action that coexisted with an almost complete absence of the emotional response the situation seemed to demand. The emotion, the full weight of what had happened, arrived later, sometimes much later, in a delayed wave that bore no relationship to the circumstances of the moment in which it finally broke. The normalization had been so thorough that even the event it had been organized around could not immediately penetrate it. The grief had to wait for the architecture of fear to relax enough to let it in. Fact number 90. In the years immediately following the war, across all the major combatant nations, a phenomenon emerged that social historians have variously described as the conspiracy of silence, the great forgetting, or simply the pressure of reconstruction. The collective, largely unspoken agreement to set aside the psychological processing of what had happened in favor of the practical work of rebuilding. This was not cynicism or denial in any simple sense. It was in many cases a continuation of the same adaptive mechanism that had allowed people to function during the war, the compression of emotional content in service of immediate demands, the deferral of inner reckoning in favor of outer necessity. The difference was that the outer necessity was now reconstruction rather than survival, and the emotional material being deferred was not active fear but the accumulated residue of years of normalized fear, the grief, the moral complexity, the physical and psychological exhaustion that had been held at bay for so long it had begun to feel like a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. The generation that had fought and endured largely did not speak of it to their children. The children grew up in houses full of a history that was present in every silence, every flinch, every sleepless night, but that was never named, which is perhaps the final and most durable form of fear normalization that the war produced, the transformation of lived experience into inherited silence. Fact number 91. The island of Okinawa, site of the last major land campaign of the Pacific War between April and June 1945, offers one of the most concentrated and devastating examples of civilian fear normalization and its collapse in the entire wartime record. Okinawan civilians were caught between two armies, subject to American bombardment from the sea and air, and simultaneously pressured by Japanese military forces who regarded civilian survival as secondary to military resistance and in some cases actively prevented civilians from surrendering to American forces. Survivor accounts describe a rapid and complete collapse of the ordinary psychological architecture within days of the fighting reaching civilian areas, not normalization but dissolution, a state in which the adaptive mechanisms that had served other civilian populations over months and years of sustained but lower-level threat were simply overwhelmed by the speed and completeness of the catastrophe. What emerged in its place was not composure but a kind of survival automatism, a reduction of consciousness to its most basic functional level, stripped of past and future, operating entirely in the present moment of immediate physical survival. For many Okinawan survivors, this state proved extremely difficult to exit after the fighting ended. The war had not normalized their fear, it had temporarily replaced them with it. Fact number 92. The two atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, produced fear experiences so far outside any existing framework of human reference that the ordinary concept of normalization becomes almost inapplicable. Survivors, the hibakusha, described not fear as it had been understood anywhere else in the war but something without a name, a total disruption of the categories through which ordinary human experience is organized. Time, space, social identity, physical integrity, the relationship between cause and effect, all of these were shattered simultaneously in a way that no prior experience of bombardment, however severe, had approached. The hibakusha accounts collected by researchers such as Robert J. Lifton in the 1960s describe a specific psychological state that Lifton termed psychic numbing, a radical suppression of emotional response in the face of an event so far beyond the scale of manageable experience that the psyche's only option was a near-total shutdown. What is distinctive about the hibakusha experience in the context of fear normalization is that it represents not the endpoint of a gradual adaptive process, but its instantaneous induction, a single event of sufficient magnitude to force the nervous system immediately into the state that other populations reached only after months or years of incremental exposure. The cost of this instantaneous normalization was correspondingly severe, and the hibakusha carried it for the rest of their lives in ways that ordinary models of wartime psychological adaptation were entirely inadequate to describe. Fact number 93. The children of World War II veterans, the generation born in the late 1940s and 1950s, grew up not with their parents' fear but with its residue, and the transmission of that residue constitutes one of the war's longest and most diffuse legacies. This intergenerational transmission was not deliberate. Parents who had normalized fear so thoroughly that it had become invisible to themselves could not identify it as something they were passing on. What they passed on instead were behaviors, emotional patterns, and relational styles shaped by years of sustained danger that had receded from conscious awareness but remained embedded in the nervous system. Children of veterans across multiple cultures describe recognizing, often only in adulthood, that the emotional atmosphere of their childhood homes had been shaped by something they could not name, a vigilance without an object, a restraint without an apparent reason, a particular quality of silence in response to certain topics that communicated, wordlessly, that there were places in the family history that were not safe to approach. Researchers studying this intergenerational transmission have found consistent patterns across populations as different as British working-class families, American suburban households, Israeli kibbutz communities, and Japanese urban families. The fear had normalized, the war had ended, but the nervous systems that had been rebuilt around sustained danger continued, in the privacy of family life and in the quiet channels of parent-child relationship, to do their work, passing forward, generation by generation, the shape of what it had cost to survive. Fact number 94. The doctors who worked in civilian hospitals in bombed cities, London, Coventry, Rotterdam, Hamburg, Tokyo, occupy a particular place in the history of wartime fear normalization because they were required to maintain clinical precision at the exact point where fear's consequences were most physically visible. A surgeon operating in a hospital basement during a raid was managing not only the demands of the procedure and the physiological fear of the bombardment above, but the specific professional fear of making a mistake under conditions designed to maximize the likelihood of error. Poor light, intermittent power, inadequate supplies, the knowledge that the building might not be standing when the operation was complete. The normalization of this compound professional plus existential fear followed a trajectory that post-war interviews with civilian surgeons describe with consistency: an initial period of degraded performance as the brain struggled to allocate attention across competing demands, followed by a progressive narrowing of focus that eventually produced something resembling ordinary surgical concentration even in extraordinary conditions. Senior surgeons describe teaching junior colleagues to achieve this narrowing through the simplest possible means, directing their attention to the immediate procedural step, refusing to allow discussion of conditions beyond the operating table, insisting on the absolute primacy of the task in front of them. The operating table in this model became an island of determined normality within the chaos of bombardment, small, fragile, and entirely deliberate. Fact number 95. One of the final forms of fear normalization that World War II produced was perhaps the most consequential in terms of its long-term historical effects: the normalization, within Allied political and military planning, of the idea of mass civilian casualties as an acceptable cost of strategic air warfare. This was not the personal fear normalization of an individual nervous system but an institutional one, the adaptation of official frameworks of military ethics to accommodate something that before the war would have been considered clearly beyond the bounds of legitimate warfare. The process was gradual. The Blitz had demonstrated that civilian bombardment was a real tool of war. The RAF's Bomber Command had developed area bombing doctrine through operational necessity and strategic theory. By the time of the major Allied bombing campaigns of 1944 and 1945, the destruction of Dresden, the firebombing of Japanese cities, the atomic attacks, the institutional normalization was essentially complete. Decision-makers who were by any measure decent, thoughtful people were ordering operations that killed tens of thousands of civilians in single nights, and doing so with a professional calm that had been built piece by piece through years of incremental escalation. Each step had been slightly larger than the last. Each step had been normalized before the next was taken. The endpoint was a category of destruction that no one in 1939 would have sanctioned, arrived at through a process so gradual that the full distance traveled was visible only in retrospect, a lesson about institutional fear normalization and the accumulation of precedent that the post-war world would need many decades to fully absorb. Fact number 96. In the final weeks of the war in the Pacific, Japanese civilians on the home islands found themselves in a fear state that had passed beyond normalization and entered a territory with no adequate name. Years of propaganda had told them that American forces would commit atrocities against the civilian population in the event of a land invasion, a message reinforced by the experience of Okinawa, news of which had reached the mainland in distorted but terrifying fragments. The civilian training programs of 1944 and 1945 had issued millions of Japanese civilians with bamboo spears and instructed them in resistance techniques that everyone who held a spear understood were entirely inadequate against the forces they would face. The fear this situation produced had moved beyond functional adaptation into a collective psychological state closer to resigned anticipation of catastrophe. Survivor accounts from this period describe a quality of daily life in the summer of 1945 that was simultaneously hyper-real and dreamlike, each ordinary task performed with a vividness sharpened by the possibility that it might be among the last, each interaction between family members carrying an unspoken weight that no one acknowledged directly. When the surrender announcement came on August 15th, the emotional response described in survivor accounts was not relief, but a complex, disorienting mixture of survival guilt, exhausted disbelief, and a strange grief for the self that had been prepared for an ending that had not arrived. Fact number 97. The long peace that followed World War II in Western Europe and North America, the decades of relative stability that historians have called the Long Peace, was built in part on the exhausted resolution of populations that had been so thoroughly shaped by the experience of sustained fear that they carried a visceral bodily understanding of what large-scale conflict actually costs. The generation that had normalized fear during the war did not theorize about peace. They chose it with the specificity of people who knew exactly what the alternative felt like from the inside, the smell of it, the weight of it, the particular quality of a morning when you did not know if the evening would arrive. Politicians and diplomats made the institutional arguments for the post-war international order. But the social and political support for that order, the broad popular consensus in favor of international cooperation, stable institutions, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, was rooted in something older and more bodily than institutional argument. It was rooted in the lived residue of years of normalized fear, carried in the nervous systems of millions of ordinary people who had learned, at considerable personal cost, what it was like to live in a world organized around the permanent possibility of death. That knowledge, irreducibly personal and irreducibly physical, was the hidden foundation on which the post-war world was built, and its gradual fading, as the generations that carried it aged and died, is among the most significant and least acknowledged transitions that the late 20th and early 21st centuries have quietly undergone. Fact number 98. Among the final observations that emerge from the full sweep of World War II fear normalization accounts is the role of humor, specifically the dark, understated, professionally coded humor that developed within military units and civilian communities under sustained pressure. This humor was not a denial of fear but a form of its social management, a shared acknowledgement, expressed in a mode that diffused rather than amplified, that the situation was genuinely terrible and that the people in it were nonetheless continuing to function. RAF aircrew humor about missing colleagues, the bitter wit of Leningrad siege survivors, the sardonic commentary of London Blitz civilians, the black jokes of concentration camp inmates documented by Viktor Frankl. All of these operated by the same basic psychological mechanism, the reframing of fear's content into a form that could be shared without producing the emotional escalation that direct expression would have caused. Modern psychological research on humor as a coping mechanism has consistently found that dark humor in crisis conditions correlates with resilience rather than pathology, that the capacity to find something briefly, darkly funny in a situation of genuine danger is a marker of psychological flexibility rather than callousness. World War II produced an extraordinary body of this kind of humor, much of it now lost, most of it never recorded, almost none of it translatable outside the specific community and moment that generated it. It was private, perishable, and entirely serious in its purpose, one of the most human things that the war produced, and one of the least commemorated. Fact number 99. The women who staffed the telephone exchanges and communication centers in bombed British cities, maintaining the connections between civil defense, hospitals, emergency services, and the public through the height of the Blitz, represent a final, quiet example of the relationship between functional role and fear normalization. Their work required them to remain at their switchboards while raids were in progress, to continue routing calls, maintaining composure in their voices, managing multiple simultaneous connections with precision, under conditions of genuine physical danger. Early accounts describe the difficulty of this, the concentration required to do precise, fast-moving work while the building shook and the air filled with dust and the sounds of impact arrived through the headset mixed with the voices of callers in distress. Over time, switchboard operators developed a form of professional concentration so complete that veterans described being genuinely unable to recall, afterward, specific details of raids they had worked through. The task had consumed all available attention, leaving nothing over for the encoding of personal experience. This is perhaps the most complete form of fear normalization that the wartime record documents. Not the management of fear alongside function, but its complete displacement by function, a state in which the task was so fully present that there was simply no remaining cognitive space for the fear that objectively should have been there. The calls kept coming, the connections kept being made, and the fear for the duration of the shift had nowhere to go and nothing to become. Fact number 100. As the war drew to its close in both Europe and the Pacific, a final, strange phase of fear experience emerged among those who had spent years building their psychological lives around sustained danger, the fear of peace itself. This was not metaphorical or romantic. It was a genuine, if rarely articulated, anxiety about the removal of the conditions that had organized daily life for so long that their absence was itself disorienting. Veterans described it as a background unease in the weeks following surrender, a restlessness without an object, a sense that something necessary had been taken away even as something terrible had ended. Civilians who had structured their days around shelter routines, rationing disciplines, and civil defense duties found the removal of these structures unexpectedly destabilizing. The routines had been burdensome, but they had also been organizing. had given the day a shape and a purpose that ordinary peacetime life did not immediately replace. This fear of peace was temporary for most people, gradually dissolving as peacetime life reasserted itself and new structures replaced the wartime ones. But for some, particularly those whose wartime psychological adaptation had been deepest and most thoroughgoing, it lingered, a quiet marker of how completely the war had remade the inner world of the people who had lived through it, and how long the work of unmaking that remaking would take. Fact number 101. The most enduring lesson of wartime fear normalization is not about fear at all, but about the human being's relationship with the conditions of their own life, the remarkable, costly, necessary capacity to adapt to whatever the world presents, to find a way to function within it, and to build, in the midst of conditions designed to prevent it, something that feels enough like ordinary life to sustain the will to continue. World War II demonstrated this capacity at a scale and across a diversity of human experience that has no parallel in recorded history. From the London switchboard operator to the Leningrad schoolteacher, from the Gurkha soldier to the hidden child in Amsterdam, from the code breaker in her hut to the surgeon in his basement, each of them through processes that were individual and collective, deliberate and accidental, consciously understood and entirely intuitive, found a way to absorb the unabsorbable, to normalize what should not have been normal, and to continue. The cost of this was real, extensive, and in many cases never fully paid. The normalization that made survival possible also made healing difficult, because the same mechanisms that protected during danger also sealed off the avenues through which recovery requires travel. The war ended. The fear, slowly, in most cases receded, but the shape of what it had required to survive it, the narrowed emotional range, the hyper-vigilant attention, the deferred grief, the inherited silence, these persisted, passing forward through families and communities in forms too quiet and too pervasive to easily name. To remember this is not to diminish the achievement of survival, it is to honor it fully, to see not just that people endured, but what enduring actually cost, and to hold that cost with the seriousness and the tenderness it deserves. There is a particular kind of courage that never appears in the history books because it looks from the outside exactly like ordinary life continuing. It does not announce itself. It does not carry a weapon or issue a declaration. It simply gets up in the morning and makes tea and goes about its day in a world that has become genuinely dangerous. And it does this not once or twice but for months and years, until the getting up and the making of tea and the going about the day in a dangerous world has become so habitual that the courage woven into it becomes invisible, even to the person performing it. This is what fear normalization means, in its truest and most human sense. It is not the erasure of fear. It is not bravery in the theatrical sense that the word sometimes implies. It is something quieter and more demanding than that, the daily unremarked work of continuing to function when every reliable signal the nervous system possesses is telling you that function is not safe. It is the London fire watcher who has learned to read the sound of falling debris, the French farm wife who meets the German officer's eyes without flinching, the Leningrad librarian who opens the reading room despite the cold and the hunger and the knowledge of what the bread ration contains, the Pacific Marine who moves through jungle he has learned to hear, the Manchester mother who makes the shelter feel, through the precision of her small rituals, like somewhere a child can sleep. What World War II produced, in its 6 years and across its unimaginable breadth of human experience, was a global experiment in the limits and the costs of this kind of courage. The results of that experiment are written not in the treaties and the victory parades but in the private records, the diaries, the letters, the clinical notes, the oral histories, the patterns of post-war mental health, the silences in family conversations that persisted for decades after the guns fell quiet. What those records show, consistently and across every culture and context the war touched, is that the human capacity for fear normalization is both extraordinary and finite. Extraordinary, because the evidence of what ordinary people endured and continued to function within is genuinely staggering. Finite, because every account that documents the adaptation also documents the cost, the narrowing, the depletion, the deferred grief, the inheritance of silence passed forward to children who grew up in the long shadow of a history they were never fully told. The war taught the world something about human beings that the world was not entirely ready to receive, that survival is not the same as wholeness, that endurance is not the same as healing, and that the mechanisms which protect us during crisis carry their own kind of damage, quiet and cumulative. that requires acknowledgement and care of its own. It also taught something else, less spoken but equally true, that within the fear, within the narrowing and the depletion and the cost, there was also something that sustained: the small rituals, the dark humor, the shared cup of tea, the animal companion on the airfield, the letter read so many times it fell apart at the folds, the child's drawing tacked to a submarine wall, the library kept open in a besieged city. These were not incidental details alongside the serious business of survival. They were the serious business of survival. They were the ways in which people under sustained fear reached past the fear for something that fear could not quite reach, something small, ordinary, and stubbornly, quietly alive. To look back at the civilians and soldiers, the nurses and code breakers, the resistance fighters and farm wives and switchboard operators and hidden children of World War II, is to look at a world that was asked to carry more than it should have been asked to carry, and that carried it anyway, imperfectly, at great cost, with ingenuity and community and humor and grief and an extraordinary, irreducible, entirely ordinary human will to continue. That is worth remembering. Rest now. The stories will keep. There is time for all of it, and you have heard enough for tonight.